Have you ever looked up at the moon on a quiet, clear night and truly wondered if human beings actually made it there? There she is, a silent sentinel of silver light, anchored gracefully in the boundless, dark ocean of space. For thousands of years, humanity could only gaze upward, weaving myths and dreaming of one day touching that pale, dusty surface. But on July 20th, 1969, the unimaginable finally happened. A fragile metal spider named Eagle descended from the heavens toward the desolate plains of the Sea of Tranquility. Two men encased in bulky white suits stepped out of their ship and into the annals of history. It was a moment of absolute triumph, a dazzling testament to human ingenuity and our relentless spirit of exploration. But before we continue our journey tonight into the shadows and the light of the lunar surface, I want to ask you to please take a brief moment to like this video, subscribe to the podcast, and leave a comment down below telling us where you are listening from. It costs absolutely nothing for you to do, but it truly helps the podcast bring more stories to life. Your support is the quiet engine that allows us to keep continuing this journey, creating these long, relaxing voyages through history together. Thank you so much for being here. And now let us return to the quiet void of space. The Apollo 11 landing was a watershed moment for the human race. An estimated 600 million people, nearly a fifth of the global population at the time, gathered around glowing, bulky television sets to watch those ghostly black and white images being beamed across 238,000 miles of absolute nothingness. The world held its collective breath. For a brief, shimmering moment in the turbulent decade of the 1960s, humanity was entirely united in a state of profound awe. The impossible had been achieved, and the moon was no longer an untouchable deity in the sky, but a tangible, physical place where human boots had left their mark. Yet, as the years drifted by, that universal sense of awe began to cast a long, peculiar shadow. The seeds of doubt began to quietly take root in the minds of a few, eventually growing into one of the most enduring and fascinating conspiracy theories of modern history. The question began as a whisper, but soon turned into a persistent echo. Did we really go? Did a man truly walk upon the moon? Or was it all a meticulously crafted illusion? To understand the genesis of this massive doubt, we have to gently step back into the socio-political climate of the 1970s. The triumphant glow of the Apollo era faded into a period of deep national cynicism in the United States. The prolonged tragedy of the Vietnam War had deeply scarred the public conscience. The revelation of the Pentagon Papers and the unfolding drama of the Watergate scandal shattered the implicit trust that citizens once held for their government and their institutions. A dangerous, lingering question permeated the culture. If the authorities could lie so profoundly about wars and politics, what else were they lying about? Could they have fabricated the greatest achievement in human history? The modern lunar conspiracy theory can be traced back to a specific origin point. In 1976, a man named Bill Kaysing Self published a pamphlet that would change the landscape of historical skepticism forever. The booklet was provocatively titled, "We Never Went to the Moon: America's $30 billion Swindle." Kaysing was not entirely an outsider to the space industry. He had worked as a technical writer for Rocketdyne, the company that helped design the massive F-1 engines for the Saturn V rocket. However, his employment ended in 1963, well before the Apollo missions actually launched. Despite lacking formal training in engineering or physics, Kaysing possessed a powerful, persuasive narrative style. He argued that the probability of a successful manned landing on the moon was mathematically almost zero. He suggested that NASA, facing immense pressure from the Cold War, space race, and the looming deadline set by the late President John F. Kennedy, realized they could not safely achieve the mission. Instead of admitting defeat to the Soviet Union, Kaysing claimed they chose to fake the entire endeavor, filming the historic spacewalks inside a highly secretive soundstage somewhere in the desolate Nevada desert. Kaysing's claims resonated with a public already primed for distrust. He was soon joined by other voices, including members of the Flat Earth Society, who had their own cosmological reasons to reject the concept of a spherical moon orbiting a spherical Earth. They famously accused the science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke of scripting the fake missions, and claimed that legendary filmmaker Stanley Kubrick, fresh off the success of 2001, A Space Odyssey, was hired by the government to direct the fraudulent footage. The psychology behind these doubts is a fascinating subject in itself. Space is an environment of unimaginable hostility. It is a deadly vacuum filled with lethal cosmic radiation, micrometeorites, and extreme fluctuations in temperature. The idea that humans could build a machine out of aluminum, wire, and early computing technology, a computer less powerful than the simplest modern calculator, and navigate this deadly void to land on another celestial body, feels almost like magic. For some, it is simply easier and psychologically safer to believe in a tightly controlled earthly lie than to accept the terrifying, chaotic, and incredibly dangerous truth of space exploration. A conspiracy theory offers a strange kind of comfort. It proposes that someone, somewhere, is in absolute control of the narrative. But as we drift deeper into this script, we're not going to rely on psychology or political theory. We are going to look directly at the physical evidence, the photographic anomalies, and the persistent questions that have kept the Apollo hoax theory alive for over half a century. Over the next 14 parts of our journey, we will calmly and methodically examine the most famous pillars of the moon landing conspiracy. We will ask the questions that skeptics have shouted for decades, and we will listen to the quiet, undeniable answers provided by the laws of physics, the science of photography, and the thousands of brilliant minds who dedicated their lives to the Apollo program. We will look closely at the fluttering flag standing in a vacuum. We will search for the missing stars in the pitch-black lunar sky. We will trace the path of deadly radiation through the Van Allen belts, and we will analyze the peculiar, dancing shadows cast upon the dusty surface of the moon. There is no need for anger or heated debate in our exploration tonight. We will simply let the facts unfold like a map laid out under a warm, gentle light. So close your eyes, relax your breathing, and let your mind float back to the summer of 1969. Let us separate the myths from the moon rock and discover why the truth of what humanity achieved up there in the silent dark is far more magnificent than any fiction ever created. As we drift seamlessly into that historic summer, our mind's eye naturally settles upon a singular, brightly colored object standing in stark contrast to the endless expanse of gray. It is perhaps the most heavily scrutinized visual anomaly of the entire Apollo 11 mission, permanently etched into the collective memory of humanity. We are looking at the precise moment the bright, vibrant colors of the American flag were planted into the desolate, charcoal dust of the Sea of Tranquility. The flag stands stark against the infinite blackness of space, a fragile, brilliant symbol of earthly achievement resting peacefully in an entirely alien world. But for those looking through the lens of skepticism, this majestic image is exactly where the grand illusion begins to unravel. The doubt is quite straightforward, and on the surface, it relies on a very simple, everyday observation that anyone can understand. When we look at the television broadcasts and the high-resolution photographs taken by Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, the flag appears to be rippling. It looks exactly as though it is catching a stiff, invisible breeze, the fabric bunching and waving, appearing highly dynamic and very much alive. It is a beautifully heroic image, but it presents a glaring logical problem for those who question the official historical narrative. The human brain is heavily conditioned by the comforting environment of Earth, where we are constantly surrounded by an invisible, moving ocean of air. For our entire lives, we observe the physical world operating under specific atmospheric rules. When we see a piece of fabric fluttering in the distance, our brains instantly and subconsciously identify the root cause. It is wind. It is the invisible movement of atmospheric gases pushing gently or violently against a solid, flexible object. But the moon, as we have long known from quiet astronomical observations, is a completely dead and silent world. It possesses absolutely no atmosphere, no blue sky, and absolutely no wind of any kind. It is a perfect, desolate, and entirely empty vacuum. Therefore, the skeptic asks with a tone of quiet victory, how can a piece of nylon wave in a place where there is absolutely no air to move it? The immediate conclusion drawn by those who doubt the reality of the mission is that the video footage must be a careless lie. They propose that the lunar landing was secretly shot on a massive soundstage, carefully hidden away in a classified military installation or deep within the remote Nevada desert. In this conspiratorial scenario, the fluttering of the flag was a catastrophic amateur mistake by the film crew. They argue it was a visual anomaly caused by a rogue air conditioning duct, an open studio door catching a sudden draft, or a massive cooling fan blowing directly onto the hot set while the cameras rolled. It is a highly compelling narrative because it feeds directly into our earthly intuition and our natural suspicion of authority. It makes perfect sense, but only if you completely forget that the strict, unyielding rules of physics change dramatically when you step outside our protective, airy atmosphere. To find the gentle, logical truth behind the fluttering fabric, we must first look at the brilliant and highly pragmatic engineering that took place long before the mighty Saturn V rocket ever ignited. NASA engineers were acutely aware of the harsh conditions waiting within the lunar vacuum. They knew with absolute certainty that if they simply attached a standard piece of cloth to a vertical pole, the flag would hang completely limp and invisible in the weak gravity of the moon. It would look like a sad, deflated rag upon the most triumphant stage imaginable, completely ruining the photographic and symbolic impact of the monumental event. They desperately needed a way to display the stars and stripes proudly, making it look majestic without the aid of any earthly wind. The elegant solution was designed by a man named Jack Kinsler, who served as the Chief of Technical Services at the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston. He envisioned a completely unique flag assembly designed specifically for the dead vacuum of space. He casually purchased standard nylon flags from a local Sears department store and meticulously modified them for the long journey. He sewed a horizontal hem along the top edge of the fabric and carefully inserted a rigid, telescoping aluminum rod directly across the top. The master plan was incredibly simple and incredibly clever. The astronauts would plant the vertical pole securely into the lunar ground, and then they would pull the horizontal rod outward, locking the delicate fabric into a permanent, outstretched rectangle. The flag was quite literally propped open, held proudly in place by cold, rigid metal, and not by the breath of the wind. But as with any grand, unprecedented expedition into the unknown dark, things rarely go perfectly according to the flawless blueprints drawn back on Earth. When Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong attempted to deploy the flag on the dusty surface, they encountered a rather frustrating mechanical problem. The continuous twisting, turning, and tight binding of the horizontal rod during its long transit through the void of space had caused the delicate locking mechanism to jam. Despite their absolute best efforts, wrestling with the metal inside their heavily pressurized and highly cumbersome protective gloves, the two men simply could not fully extend the upper telescoping rod. As a direct result of this minor failure, the flag remained slightly bunched up on its metal frame. This mechanical stubbornness created permanent physical wrinkles in the stiff nylon fabric. This beautifully accidental texture is the first half of the visual illusion that heavily fuels the conspiracy. The flag appears to be rippling in the iconic still photographs, not because it is currently waving in a breeze, but because it is physically frozen in a permanently wrinkled state. The astronauts actually liked the artistic appearance of it so much that on all subsequent Apollo missions, the lunar crews intentionally left the horizontal rod partially retracted. They vastly preferred the dynamic, seemingly wind-swept aesthetic over a flat, unnatural, and highly rigid rectangular board. The deep, rolling wrinkles you see in the iconic still photos are entirely static. They are pieces of sculptured fabric standing perfectly still in the eternal silence of the vacuum. But what about the actual moving video footage broadcast back to Earth? There are absolutely moments in the grainy television broadcast where the flag is visibly moving, swinging back and forth with undeniable energy as the astronauts handle the pole. To completely understand this movement, we must lean gently into the beautiful simplicity of Sir Isaac Newton's first law of motion. An object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by an outside force. On Earth, when you aggressively wave a flag on a pole and then suddenly stop your hand, the fabric quickly settles down and stops moving. The movement is rapidly stolen by the dense friction of our atmosphere, the drag of the heavy air, physically pulling the kinetic energy out of the cloth until it hangs still once again. Now I invite you to transport your mind completely to the entirely silent, airless environment of the lunar surface. The soil beneath the astronauts' heavy treaded boots was incredibly dense and tightly packed, beneath a very thin, deceptive layer of loose, powdery dust. To force the blunt metal end of the flagpole deep into this remarkably hard surface, Armstrong and Aldrin had to physically grip the aluminum tube and twist it aggressively back and forth, forcing it down into the regolith like a manual hand drill. Every single twist of their thick gloved hands and every strenuous shake of their bulky arms transferred violent kinetic energy directly into the metal pole. That energy vibrated straight up into the horizontal rod and poured directly into the delicate nylon fabric of the flag. In the absolute, unforgiving airless environment of the Moon, there is absolutely zero aerodynamic drag to slow things down. There is obviously no wind to start the motion, but crucially, there is also no air whatsoever to stop it from moving once it has excitedly begun. When the astronauts twisted and shoved the pole, they were unwittingly turning the entire flag assembly into a frictionless pendulum. The fabric swung and whipped back and forth, conserving its kinetic energy almost perfectly, moving in a strange, continuous, undampened way that looks profoundly unnatural to our earthly eyes. It was not fluttering lazily in a gentle summer breeze. It was vibrating violently in a pure vacuum, ringing exactly like a solid brass bell struck in the deep, unending silence of outer space. The ultimate proof of this scientific phenomenon, the quiet, undeniable visual fact that dissolves the soundstage theory entirely into dust, lies in the uninterrupted, hours-long video footage of the mission. If you sit and watch the entire unedited broadcast, you will see exactly what happens when the astronauts finally release their tight grip on the aluminum pole. They slowly step back, taking their heavy, bounding, slow-motion strides away from the colorful monument they have just erected with such effort. And then, a truly fascinating and scientifically beautiful thing occurs right before the lens. The flag completely stops. It ceases all pendulum movement and becomes a frozen, rigid monument in the desolate dust. For the entire remainder of the multi-hour spacewalk, as the astronauts gather gray rocks, set up complex scientific instruments, and bound joyfully across the barren lunar landscape, the flag remains perfectly, unnervingly still. It does not twitch a single inch. It does not sway in the very slightest. It holds its artificially wrinkled shape with the absolute rigidity of a carved stone statue. If the initial frantic movement had been caused by an earthly breeze or a hidden air conditioning unit blowing across a Hollywood set, that breeze would have to have magically ceased completely and forever. At the precise millisecond Neil Armstrong's white glove left the aluminum pole. The absolute, unwavering stillness of the flag in the long, quiet hours that followed is the silent, indisputable fingerprint of the true lunar vacuum. It is a beautiful, flawless demonstration of classical physics playing out exactly as it should on a magnificent, dusty celestial stage. So, the next time you see that iconic, colorful image, let the earthly illusion gently fade away from your mind. Recognize it not for the phantom wind that simply wasn't there, but for the profound, empty silence that allowed it to stand so perfectly frozen in time. Let that deep, historical stillness wash over you, relaxing your mind as we prepare to continue our unbroken journey, looking upward past the fabric and into the deeply misunderstood darkness of the starry void above. As our eyes naturally drift upward from the frozen, sculpted fabric of the flag, we find ourselves staring directly into the ultimate abyss. In every high-resolution photograph brought back from the surface of the moon, the backdrop is a profound, uninterrupted expanse of perfect blackness. It is a sky utterly devoid of clouds, color, and most strikingly, devoid of any twinkling lights. The vast and dazzling tapestry of the cosmos, which has inspired poets and navigators since the dawn of our species, is completely missing from the photographic frame. For those who search the historical record for cracks and imperfections, this pure, empty void is not seen as a beautiful natural phenomenon, but as a glaring omission that proves the entire mission was an earthly fabrication. The argument regarding the missing stars forms the heavy foundation for one of the most persistent and intuitively appealing doubts surrounding the moon landings. The reasoning seems to make perfect, undeniable logical sense to our earthly minds. Here on our home planet, we gaze up through a thick, protective veil of atmospheric gases, moisture, and rampant light pollution that heavily distorts and blocks out the faintest light of the distant cosmos. We know from personal experience that when we travel high into the remote mountains, far away from the glowing halos of our modern cities. The night sky explodes into a breathtaking canopy of millions of sparkling diamonds. Therefore, the skeptic argues with firm conviction, if you were to travel beyond our murky atmosphere entirely and stand upon the airless, unpolluted surface of the moon, the stars should be infinitely brighter, clearer, and far more magnificent than anything ever witnessed by human eyes on Earth. Yet, the official Apollo photographs show absolutely nothing but an impenetrable, suffocating wall of dark. For those who passionately believe the landings were intricately fabricated on a massive, highly classified soundstage, this starless void is viewed as a calculated and highly paranoid omission by the filmmakers. They theorize that the secretive architects of the hoax realized a terrifying, insurmountable truth early in the production process. If they attempted to paint or optically project a fake glittering star field onto the massive backdrop of their Nevada studio, the brilliant and obsessive astronomers of the world would immediately map the constellations and spot the fatal errors. A single tiny star painted slightly out of place, or a familiar constellation scaled incorrectly on the dark canvas, would instantly betray the entire multi-billion-dollar illusion to the scientific community. So, the theory confidently suggests the government took the easiest and safest way out. They simply painted the massive ceiling of the soundstage a flat, matte black, avoiding the complex astronomical problem altogether, and hoping the general public simply wouldn't notice the missing universe. It is an incredibly compelling story, wrapped neatly in a dark bow of plausible paranoia and government mistrust. But just as we discovered with the beautifully still fabric of the flag, the true historical answer is far more fascinating, and it relies entirely on the strict, unforgiving mathematics of photography and the predictable behavior of light. To truly understand the starless sky, we must first deeply understand the magnificent analog machinery the astronauts carried with them across the void. Strapped securely to the bulky chests of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were specially modified, exquisitely crafted Hasselblad cameras. These devices were mechanical masterpieces of their era, deliberately stripped of their internal viewing mirrors to save precious weight, and heavily coated in a bright silver finish to reflect the blistering, dangerous heat of the unfiltered sun. They were designed to capture the absolute highest quality medium format film images possible, but they were still strictly bound by the fundamental, unbending laws of optical physics. The most crucial piece of contextual evidence that skeptics almost always overlook is the exact, specific time of day that the lunar landings actually took place. The Apollo astronauts did not land in the quiet, comforting dark of the lunar night. They purposely touched down during the early hours of the long lunar morning. This timing was absolutely critical for navigation, visibility, and temperature control on the surface. At that precise moment in history, the sun was blazing fiercely in the black sky above them, completely unfiltered and undiminished by any protective atmosphere. Its raw, intense radiation poured directly onto the lunar surface with a blinding intensity that is difficult for us to even imagine here on Earth. Furthermore, the surface of the moon itself is covered in a fine, powdery, charcoal-colored regolith that is surprisingly reflective when struck directly by such raw, unfiltered sunlight. Everything in the immediate vicinity of the landing site was a beacon of intensely bright, bouncing light. The astronauts themselves were heavily encased in bright, stark white spacesuits, designed specifically to reflect as much solar radiation as possible, to keep them from overheating and perishing in the vacuum. The lunar module itself, the spindly ship that carried them safely down, was wrapped entirely in highly reflective mirror-like mylar and shining gold foil. In the harsh, raw sunlight of deep space, everything on the dusty surface of the Sea of Tranquility was fiercely, almost blindingly bright. Photography, at its very core, is simply the physical art and science of capturing light over a specific duration of time. When you attempt to take a photograph of an incredibly bright, highly reflective subject, you must severely limit the amount of light that enters the camera lens to avoid completely ruining the image. If you let too much light in, the sensitive chemical film becomes instantly overexposed, leaving you with nothing but a useless, washed-out white rectangle where absolutely no details can be seen. To prevent this catastrophic loss of historical data, the astronauts had to use very fast shutter speeds, typically around 1/250th of a second, combined with a very small, tightly closed aperture. This incredibly rapid mechanical blink of the camera's eye was the exact, mathematically calculated fraction of time needed to perfectly capture the brilliant white spacesuits and the glaring sunlit dust beneath their boots, without completely burning the delicate analog film. Now, with that rapid, fleeting blink in mind, let us patiently reconsider the distant, missing stars. Despite their immense, terrifying size and their incredible atomic power, the stars are unimaginably far away from our tiny corner of the solar system. Because of this vast, incomprehensible distance, the light that finally reaches us across the dark ocean of space is incredibly faint and delicate. To capture the quiet, whispering light of distant stars on any kind of photographic film or digital sensor, a camera absolutely requires a very long exposure. The mechanical shutter must be left wide open for several seconds or even several minutes to allow enough faint, scattered photons to slowly gather, layer upon layer, and physically burn their dim image onto the emulsion. This is precisely why modern astrophotographers use heavy tripods, specialized tracking mounts, and incredibly long exposure settings to capture the glowing bands of the Milky Way galaxy here on Earth. You simply cannot capture faint, distant starlight in a mere rapid fraction of a second. This fundamental law of optics brings us directly to the irreconcilable conflict at the very heart of the starless void theory. The specific camera settings required to photograph a brilliantly lit, bright white astronaut in the glaring, unfiltered light of a lunar morning are the exact mathematical opposite of the settings required to photograph faint, distant stars in the deep black of space. If Neil Armstrong had manually adjusted his silver Hasselblad camera to a long, multi-second exposure just to capture the romantic beauty of the surrounding cosmos, the shutter would have stayed open far too long. The distant stars would have beautifully and slowly emerged in the background of the frame. But simultaneously, the bright, sunlit lunar surface and Buzz Aldrin's highly reflective white suit would have completely and violently flooded the lens with brilliant light. It would have burned away all structural detail, leaving nothing behind but a massive, blinding white flare, covering the entirety of the historic photograph. You can very easily recreate this exact counterintuitive phenomenon tonight, right here on our own planet, using a simple camera or a modern smartphone. Imagine walking outside on a beautifully clear, cloudless, deeply starry night. If you stand completely alone in the middle of a dark, unlit field and point your lens at the sky with a long exposure setting, you will effortlessly capture the glowing dusting of the stars. But now, Imagine standing directly underneath a blindingly bright stadium floodlight, having a friend stand before you wearing a highly reflective, bright white safety jacket, and taking a quick, fast shutter snapshot of them. Your friend will be perfectly sharply illuminated in the resulting image, but the night sky directly behind them will be rendered as a pitch, featureless black by the camera's sensor. The brilliant, overwhelming foreground completely drowns out the faint, delicate background. The camera simply cannot process both extremes of the lighting spectrum at exactly the same time. The heavy, black, completely empty sky in the beautiful Apollo photographs is not a careless mistake made by an anxious Hollywood director. It is the precise, mathematically unavoidable physical signature of optical science, operating in an environment of extreme, violent contrast. It is, in fact, the absolute visual proof that these historical images were taken exactly where they claim to be. They were taken in a vacuum where unfiltered, blinding sunlight bounces fiercely off a dead, airless world. The stars were always there, burning silently and magnificently in the vast expanse above the sea of tranquility, exactly as they have for billions of years. The astronauts themselves reported seeing them, but only under very specific, carefully controlled viewing conditions. When they physically stepped into the deep, absolute darkness of the lunar module's shadow, allowing their pupils to slowly dilate and physically shielding their eyes from the overwhelming glare of the illuminated landscape, the stars slowly began to reveal themselves. They emerged from the blackness, shining with a steady, unblinking light that is impossible to see through Earth's shimmering atmosphere. But the mechanical, glassy eyes strapped to their chests, tasked strictly with preserving the historic, sunlit steps of humanity in the blazing light of the morning, simply had no time to see them. As we let the quiet, unforgiving science of light and exposure settle slowly into our minds, the deep darkness of the lunar sky stops feeling like an eerie deception. Instead, it becomes a profound, undeniable testament to the stark reality of their incredible journey. It reminds us that they were walking, breathing, and working in an environment that is deeply hostile and entirely alien to our earthly senses. The starless void is not a hidden, shameful secret, but a quiet, beautiful truth of photography operating in the harsh reality of deep space. Take a deep, slow breath and let the pure, infinite darkness of that empty sky bring you a deep sense of calm rest as we prepare to drift forward into the next shadowy corridor of our journey. For soon, we will turn our gaze away from the missing light and confront the invisible, deadly oceans of radiation that surround our world, to discover exactly how humanity safely sailed through them. As we leave behind the haunting, starless beauty of the lunar sky, we must gently shift our awareness to a danger that cannot be seen with the human eye or captured by the lens of a Hasselblad camera. The void of space is often imagined as a profoundly empty, completely silent nothingness, a peaceful expanse of pure vacuum stretching out between the celestial bodies. But the reality of our solar system is far more complex and infinitely more energetic. The space surrounding our beautiful blue planet is entirely filled with invisible, churning oceans of force and highly charged atomic particles. For those who deeply question the reality of the Apollo missions, these invisible oceans represent an insurmountable, deadly barrier that humanity could never have crossed. We are speaking, of course, of the dreaded Van Allen radiation belts. To truly understand the origin of this specific fear, we must travel briefly back to the dawn of the space age, to the year 1958. The United States successfully launched Explorer 1, its very first artificial satellite, carrying a small, brilliant scientific instrument designed by a physicist named James Van Allen. What this small Geiger counter detected completely revolutionized our understanding of the Earth's neighborhood. It revealed that our planet is surrounded by two massive donut-shaped rings of highly energetic radiation. These deep belts are created by the Earth's magnetic field, which reaches out into space and captures billions of lethal, high-energy protons and electrons constantly being hurled outward by the solar wind and distant cosmic rays. These trapped particles whip around the Earth at speeds approaching the velocity of light, creating a zone of extreme, invisible danger. For the skeptics of the moon landing, the discovery of the Van Allen belts provides what feels like absolute biological proof that the entire lunar program was an impossible fantasy. Their argument is deeply rooted in our instinctual earthly fear of atomic energy. We all know from visiting the dentist or the hospital that X-rays and radiation are inherently dangerous to the delicate organic chemistry of the human body. We are taught that protection requires incredibly thick walls of heavy lead or massive concrete bunkers. Therefore, the skeptic argues with intense conviction, if three fragile human beings were strapped inside a spacecraft made primarily of thin, lightweight aluminum and fired directly into this raging storm of cosmic radiation, they would have been instantly and brutally cooked alive. In the minds of those who doubt, the Van Allen belts are envisioned as a solid, impenetrable brick wall of pure boiling energy. They assert that passing through this radioactive gauntlet would result in immediate, lethal cellular damage, severe radiation sickness, and a horrific death long before the astronauts ever reached the halfway point to the moon. This terrifying assumption leads them directly to a seemingly logical conclusion. They believe that NASA, fully recognizing that they could not possibly build a spacecraft heavy enough to shield the men with lead, while still being light enough to escape the Earth's gravity, chose instead to fake the entire journey. The conspiracy theory dictates that the astronauts simply orbited safely in low Earth orbit, comfortably below the deadly radiation belts, while the spectacular footage was beamed out from a heavily guarded soundstage on the ground. It is an argument driven by a very real, very understandable fear of the invisible universe. But as we shine the calm, steady light of physics and engineering upon this dark mystery, the terrifying brick wall begins to dissolve into something entirely navigable. The fundamental flaw in the skeptic's argument lies in a profound misunderstanding of how radiation exposure actually works, and an underestimation of the brilliant navigational geometry employed by the Apollo trajectory planners. The Van Allen belts are indeed vast, and they are absolutely dangerous, but they are not a uniform, solid barrier of instant death. They are highly structured, with areas of intense density and areas of relative thinness, much like the changing currents and depths of a sprawling earthly ocean. To safely cross this ocean, the scientists and mathematicians at NASA relied on two incredibly crucial variables. The first, and perhaps most important variable, was the sheer, mind-bending velocity of the Apollo spacecraft. To understand this, imagine you are standing in your kitchen, and you need to pass your bare hand through the hot, burning flame of a candle. If you move your hand incredibly slowly, allowing it to linger inside the fire, you will inevitably suffer a severe and painful burn. But if you swipe your hand through the very same flame with extreme rapid speed, you will barely feel a fleeting warmth and your skin will remain entirely unharmed. The temperature of the flame has not changed, but your total accumulated exposure time has been drastically reduced. When the third stage of the massive Saturn V rocket ignited for the translunar injection burn, it accelerated the tiny Apollo spacecraft to the astonishing speed of nearly 25,000 miles per hour. This is the escape velocity of the Earth, and it was the absolute fastest that any human being had ever traveled in the entire history of our species. At this incredible, blistering pace, the astronauts did not slowly drift or linger within the hazardous depths of the radiation belts. They pierced right through them like a high-velocity bullet. The entire transit through the most intense and dangerous regions of the inner and outer belts took only a matter of a few short hours. They were simply moving far too fast for a lethal dose of radiation to physically accumulate in their bodies. But incredible speed was not their only defense. The second crucial variable was the carefully calculated, deeply complex geometry of their flight path. The Van Allen belts are thickest and most powerful directly around the Earth's equator, swelling outward like a massive, invisible inner tube. If the Apollo spacecraft had flown straight through the dead center of this thick equatorial region, the exposure would have indeed been incredibly severe and highly problematic. However, the brilliant celestial navigators in Houston did not aim directly for the center. They plotted a highly specific, angled trajectory that bypassed the most intense, densely packed core of the inner belt altogether. They effectively threaded the needle, flying through the thinner, higher latitude edges of the magnetic fields, drastically reducing the amount of radiation hitting the hull of the ship. And what about that thin aluminum hull? Skeptics often mock the Apollo command module, comparing its metallic skin to a fragile tin can that offers zero protection. While it is entirely true that the spacecraft was not lined with heavy, impossible slabs of lead, it was far more complex than simple tin. The command module was constructed from a highly advanced, layered honeycomb of dense aluminum alloys, incredibly thick thermal insulation, and the complex, heavy machinery of the spacecraft itself. The radiation in the belts consists primarily of trapped protons and energetic electrons. The thick aluminum structure of the capsule was actually highly effective at physically absorbing and stopping the majority of these specific types of beta particles before they could reach the soft tissue of the astronauts inside. The final, quiet piece of evidence that permanently lays this doubt to rest comes directly from the bodies of the men who made the journey. Throughout the entire mission, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins continuously wore personal radiation dosimeters. These small, scientific badges meticulously recorded every single particle of radiation their bodies absorbed during the entire round trip. When they returned to Earth, and the dosimeters were carefully analyzed by medical professionals, the data revealed a fascinating, comforting truth. The total radiation dose each astronaut received over the course of the entire lunar mission was roughly equivalent to the exposure of a few standard earthly CT scans or a long-distance flight in a modern commercial airliner. It was not a perfectly benign, completely healthy environment, but it was absolutely, scientifically, far below the threshold of severe radiation sickness or lethal damage. The journey through the Van Allen belts was not a suicidal plunge into a boiling ocean of fire. It was a beautifully calculated, highly measured risk. It was the ultimate triumph of human intellect, utilizing the profound laws of mathematics, velocity, and trajectory to safely navigate one of the most hostile natural barriers surrounding our world. The invisible wall of radiation was real, but human ingenuity proved to be stronger and vastly more resilient. As we let the comforting reality of this incredible scientific achievement settle into our minds, the terrifying spectre of the radiation belts gently fades away, leaving behind a profound respect for the brilliant minds of the Apollo program. Take another long, slow breath and let the calming truth of their safe passage relax your thoughts. For our journey is far from over. Soon, we will return our gaze to the physical surface of the moon, to examine the strange conflicting light, and to unravel the profound mystery of the dancing, multi-directional shadows that lay stretched across the silent, dusty plains. Having safely navigated the invisible sweeping currents of radiation that encircle our world, we can now allow our minds to gracefully drift back down to the dusty, charcoal-gray surface of the moon. As we stand once again in the stark, blazing light of the lunar morning, our attention is drawn away from the sky and down toward the ground itself. The Apollo photographs are a mesmerizing study in extreme contrast, a beautiful interplay of brilliant, blinding whites and deep, impenetrable blacks. But for those who scrutinize these historic images searching for deception, this dramatic lighting presents a profound and seemingly glaring visual contradiction. They point their fingers at the dark shapes stretching out across the regolith, and they ask a very simple, compelling question about the erratic, dancing nature of the shadows. The observation is quite easy to make if you lay the photographs out on a table and study them closely. In a purely natural environment, illuminated by a single, distant light source like the sun, all shadows cast by objects should theoretically run perfectly parallel to one another. Yet, in several famous Apollo images, the long dark shadow cast by the lunar module clearly points in one direction, while the shadow cast by nearby rocks, or even by the astronauts themselves, seems to point at a distinctly different angle. The dark lines intersect and diverge, creating an optical geometry that feels immediately wrong to our everyday sensibilities. For the skeptic, this is not a subtle anomaly, but a screaming, definitive proof of a massive theatrical production. The earthly intuition driving this doubt is something we have all experienced. If you walk onto a dark theater stage or into a large television studio illuminated by multiple powerful spotlights hung from the ceiling, you will see shadows cast in many different, intersecting directions. The skeptics confidently argue that the diverging shadows in the Apollo photographs are the undeniable signature of multiple artificial studio lights arranged just off camera. They believe these massive lamps were positioned to perfectly light the astronauts, accidentally creating a messy, intersecting web of shadows on the fake lunar floor. It is argument that sounds incredibly rational until we deeply examine the complex reality of a three-dimensional, unpaved world captured through the flat, two-dimensional lens of a camera. The fundamental, crucial mistake made by those who doubt the images is a subconscious assumption about the lunar terrain itself. When we look at a photograph of the moon, our earthly brains tend to interpret the desolate landscape as a perfectly flat, level surface, much like a freshly paved parking lot or a smooth wooden studio floor. But the moon is not flat. The Sea of Tranquility, despite its calming name, is a rugged, ancient, and deeply battered landscape. It is gently undulating, filled with shallow depressions, rolling mounds of dust, subtle ridges, and countless tiny sloping craters that are not always immediately obvious to the naked eye. The ground rises and falls in incredibly subtle, deceptive ways. When a straight shadow falls across a heavily uneven, undulating surface, it naturally bends and contorts, strictly following the rising and falling topography of the ground beneath it. If a long shadow stretches over a small hill, it will curve upward and slightly inward. If it falls down into a shallow crater, it will bend sharply downward. When a flat, two-dimensional photograph captures these bent, three-dimensional shadows from a specific, low vantage point, the optical illusion is profound. The shadows appear to be pointing in completely different directions, when in reality, they are completely parallel, simply riding over the invisible bumps and dips of an alien world. This phenomenon is further amplified by the basic rules of photographic perspective. We are all deeply familiar with the concept of the vanishing point. If you stand perfectly still in the middle of a long, straight set of railroad tracks and look toward the horizon, the perfectly parallel steel rails appear to magically angle inward, eventually converging and touching in the far distance. The exact same optical illusion applies to the shadows stretching across the vast lunar plains. Because the shadows are long and stretching away from the camera lens, the wide-angle format of the Hasselblad cameras naturally forces these parallel lines to appear as though they are converging toward a distant vanishing point. It is not multiple studio lights. It is just the beautiful, predictable geometry of perspective playing out on an uneven canvas. But the dance of the shadows presents another, equally compelling mystery to the skeptical eye. In several iconic photographs, an astronaut is standing completely within the deep, dark shadow of the lunar module, entirely blocked from the direct, blinding light of the sun. Yet, we can still clearly see the intricate details of his white spacesuit, the patches on his shoulder, and the shimmering gold of his visor. The skeptic immediately asks, how can an object hiding inside a pitch-black shadow be so perfectly illuminated? Once again, they cry out for the existence of hidden studio fill lights, arguing that a stagehand must have pointed a bright reflector directly at the astronaut to capture the dramatic shot. The quiet, stunning reality is that there absolutely was a massive, incredibly powerful reflector illuminating the astronauts in the shadows, but it was not held by a stagehand. The reflector was the moon itself. The fine, microscopic dust covering the lunar surface is composed of jagged, glassy particles of shattered rock that are incredibly highly reflective. This property is known as albedo. While the sun was shining brightly from the sky, its intense radiation was violently bouncing off the surrounding sunlit dust in every conceivable direction. The very ground the astronauts walked upon was acting as a giant, omnidirectional mirror, bouncing brilliant scattered light back up into the shadows of the lunar module. Furthermore, the astronauts were essentially wearing giant, bright white reflectors themselves. The brilliant white fabric of their pressurized suits was specifically designed to violently reject solar energy. When Neil Armstrong stood in the brilliant sunlight taking a photograph of Buzz Aldrin standing in the dark shadow, Armstrong's own glowing white suit was bouncing massive amounts of scattered sunlight directly onto his partner. And hanging massively in the black sky above them was the Earth itself, a huge swirling marble of white clouds and blue oceans, shining dozens of times brighter than a full moon shines upon our own night sky. This incredible phenomenon, known as Earthshine, provided yet another massive source of ambient bouncing light. The lighting on the moon was not simple, and it was certainly not produced by a single, focused beam like a simple flashlight in a dark room. It was an incredibly complex, naturally chaotic environment of bouncing, refracting, and reflecting ambient light. And ironically, if the conspiracy theory were true, and NASA had indeed used multiple massive studio lamps to create the intersecting shadows and the fill lighting, they would have made a catastrophic, unavoidable visual error. Just as a football player standing on a brightly lit stadium field clearly casts four distinct shadows from the four surrounding light towers, every single object on the fake lunar set would have cast multiple, overlapping shadows. Yet, in every single photograph brought back from the Apollo missions, every object, every rock, and every astronaut casts only one singular shadow. The single, solitary shadows prove there was only one primary light source burning in the sky. The strange angles and the surprising brightness within the dark simply prove that this one light source was interacting with a bizarre, highly reflective, and beautifully uneven alien landscape. The dance of the shadows is not a flaw in the grand illusion. It is the chaotic, authentic signature of a completely real environment. Take a deep, relaxing breath and let the complex beauty of that bouncing light settle the doubts in your mind. We will now prepare to turn our gaze directly at the lunar module itself, to examine the pristine, undisturbed ground beneath it, and to search for the massive blast crater that many insist should have been left behind. As our gaze shifts away from the dancing shadows and the intricate play of ambient light, we find our focus resting heavily on the magnificent machine that brought the men safely to the surface. The Apollo lunar module, affectionately known to history as the Eagle, sits proudly amidst the silent grey desolation. It is a bizarre, spindly creation of jagged angles, wrapped tightly in gleaming gold foil and dark thermal blankets. But for those who meticulously comb through the historical archives, searching for the threads of a grand deception, it is not the bizarre shape of the ship that draws their deep suspicion. Instead, they lower their eyes and point squarely at the ground directly beneath the spacecraft. They are searching for something chaotic and violent, and they are incredibly disturbed by the fact that they cannot find it. The descent stage of the lunar module was equipped with a highly advanced, throttleable rocket engine, specifically designed to control their final, precarious drop from orbit down to the dusty plains. At maximum capability, this engine could produce roughly 10,000 pounds of fiery thrust. It was a powerful, explosive mechanism that essentially hurled burning gases directly downward to counteract the pull of gravity. With such a massive amount of downward force being violently expelled from the bell of the engine, skeptical minds naturally expect to see the severe physical consequences of that power deeply scarred into the landscape. They expect to look beneath the Eagle and find a massive, charred, and deeply excavated blast crater. Our earthly intuition is heavily molded by the spectacular, fiery rocket launches we have all seen broadcast from Cape Canaveral. We are deeply accustomed to watching the mighty Saturn V rocket ignite its engines, unleashing a terrifying hurricane of fire and concussive sound that visually shakes the television cameras miles away. We know that when a powerful jet engine points directly at the ground, it violently scorches the concrete, completely obliterates any loose soil, and violently throws debris outward for hundreds of yards in every conceivable direction. It is an absolutely chaotic, devastating release of kinetic energy. Therefore, the skeptic argues with intense logic. The 10,000 pounds of thrust from the lunar module should have aggressively gouged a deep, unmistakable hole directly beneath the landing gear. But when the skeptics look closely at the high-resolution photographs taken directly beneath the undercarriage of the lunar module, they see absolutely nothing of the sort. The charcoal grey ground directly under the engine bell appears to be completely pristine and remarkably undisturbed. There is no massive excavated crater. There are no scorch marks blackening the regolith. Even more suspicious to the doubting eye, a set of long, thin, incredibly fragile metal contact probes extending below the footpads are completely intact, and the delicate gold foil wrapping the landing struts is utterly unblemished and untorn. The heavy metal footpads simply rest gently upon the top of the dust, looking as though they were carefully placed there without any violent disturbance whatsoever. For those who doubt the complete authenticity of the mission, this glaring lack of a fiery blast crater is absolute, undeniable visual proof that the spacecraft never actually flew. They confidently assert that the intricate lunar module was simply an empty, lightweight Hollywood prop. In their minds, the ship was carefully lowered onto a beautifully raked sandbox set by a massive, unseen industrial crane hanging safely above the studio lights. It is a conclusion that effortlessly satisfies our earthly expectations of how rockets are supposed to behave, completely ignoring the incredibly complex and beautiful physics of a gentle touchdown on an alien world. To find the calming scientific truth resting beneath the silent engine bell, we must first profoundly adjust our understanding of weight and gravity. The Moon is a much smaller celestial body than the Earth, and it possesses roughly 1/6 of our planetary gravity. While the fully loaded lunar module was indeed incredibly heavy while sitting on the launch pad in Florida, its physical weight was drastically reduced the moment it entered the gravitational embrace of the Moon. Because it weighed so very little in that alien environment, the descent engine simply did not need to fire at its maximum 10,000 pounds of thrust to hold the craft aloft. In fact, to simply hover above the surface, the engine only required roughly 3,000 pounds of thrust. As Commander Neil Armstrong expertly and manually piloted the Eagle down toward the treacherous, boulder-strewn landscape of the Sea of Tranquility, he was absolutely not blasting the engine at full chaotic power. He was gently feathering the throttle, constantly adjusting the output to slowly and carefully lower the ship. By the time the fragile contact probes extending below the footpads finally brushed against the dusty surface, Armstrong had throttled the descent engine down to merely a small fraction of its total capacity. And the very moment those long probes touched the alien ground, a blue light illuminated on the control panel, and the astronauts immediately cut the engine completely. For the final few feet of the descent, the engine was entirely silent and completely turned off. The lunar module essentially fell freely through the vacuum, dropping gently into the dust and ending the thrust long before it could deeply scar the immediate surface beneath it. But the most crucial and incredibly beautiful scientific reality resolving this visual mystery lies in the fascinating behavior of pressurized gas expanding within a pure vacuum. Here on Earth, our thick, heavy atmospheric pressure forcefully squeezes the fiery, expanding exhaust of a rocket, holding it tightly together in a violently concentrated, incredibly narrow column of searing thrust. This dense atmosphere acts almost like a physical tube, forcing all of that intense energy to strike the ground in one incredibly focused, devastatingly small area. It is exactly like focusing the gentle spray of a garden hose into a powerful, sharp cutting stream. However, in the totally airless, empty vacuum of the lunar surface, there is absolutely zero atmospheric pressure to squeeze or contain the expanding engine exhaust. The very moment the hot gases violently exited the bell of the descent engine, they did not form a tight, concentrated column of destructive fire. Instead, the exhaust instantaneously and explosively expanded outward, horizontally, in an incredibly wide, beautiful, invisible cone. The massive pressure of the engine was immediately dispersed and vastly diluted over a massive, wide area of the landscape. The violent blowtorch was immediately transformed into a widely dispersed, rapidly expanding fan of thin gas. It was entirely enough force to smoothly slow the descending spacecraft, but it was far too widely dispersed to aggressively carve a deep, concentrated hole into the rock below. Furthermore, the lunar surface itself is strictly not a deep, bottomless beach of loose, powdery sand. While there is indeed a highly visible top layer of fine, clinging dust, it is remarkably thin. Just a few short inches below that soft, powdery surface lies an incredibly dense, heavily compacted layer of hard lunar regolith and solid bedrock that has been intensely compressed by billions of years of micrometeorite impacts. During the final moments of the descent, the rapidly expanding exhaust fan did absolutely blow away the top layer of loose dust in a massive horizontal sheet. Neil Armstrong clearly and specifically reported seeing this beautiful, sweeping phenomenon out his window as they touched down. But the widely dispersed, diluted gas simply did not possess anywhere near the concentrated, focused power required to drill into the incredibly hard, ancient bedrock resting just beneath that thin veil of dust. The absolutely pristine condition of the ground directly beneath the Eagle is not a careless continuity error made by a hurried and panicked set designer. It is the precise, expected, and mathematically verified signature of low-gravity physics, combining flawlessly with the rapid expansion of gas within a pure vacuum. It visually proves that the engine was properly throttled down, that the atmosphere was completely absent, and that the ground was as hard as the scientists had predicted. It is a remarkably peaceful, undisturbed image of a highly successful, brilliantly piloted landing. Let the quiet logic of vacuum physics soothe away the chaotic, earthly image of a fiery explosion. Rest your mind on the gentle, undisturbed dust lying peacefully beneath the metal engine bell. As we leave the silent ship behind and finally step out onto the lunar plains ourselves, we will soon look down at the very same grey dust to examine the strange, perfectly preserved footprints left by the men, and unravel the curious mystery of how they maintain their shape in a world completely devoid of moisture. As we gently step away from the fragile metal legs of the Eagle, we move out from the shadows and finally set foot upon the open, rolling expanse of the Sea of Tranquility. We lower our gaze from the black sky and the strange dancing lighting, and we look directly down at the very ground beneath our heavy, treaded boots. Staring back at us is one of the most intimately human and universally recognizable photographs ever captured in the entire history of our species. It is the crisp, stark, and utterly perfect image of Buzz Aldrin's solitary boot print pressed deeply into the pristine, charcoal grey dust of an alien world. It is a beautiful symbol of human presence, a delicate mark of life permanently stamped onto a dead canvas. But for those whose minds are constantly searching for the hidden strings of a grand theatrical deception, this iconic photograph is not a source of profound inspiration. Instead, it is viewed as a glaring, undeniable physical impossibility. The skepticism surrounding this beautiful footprint is incredibly deeply rooted in our everyday earthly experiences, and it relies heavily on a simple physical observation that every single one of us has made since childhood. The doubt centers entirely around the strange, seemingly magical structural integrity of the print itself, and the absolute lack of a single, crucial ingredient required to make it. That missing ingredient is water. To fully understand the skeptic's argument, we must briefly transport our minds away from the silent vacuum of space and imagine walking along a beautiful, sunlit, earthly beach. If you take off your shoes and step softly into the dry, loose, powdery sand, resting far away from the ocean waves, you will certainly leave a mark. But the moment you lift your foot, the dry sand immediately collapses back in on itself. The edges of the footprint blur and crumble. The delicate ridges of your sole are instantly lost, and the impression becomes nothing more than a shallow, shapeless depression in the dunes. The dry sand simply possesses no structural integrity. However, if you walk closer to the rolling ocean and press your foot deeply into the dark, wet sand right at the water's edge, a completely different physical phenomenon occurs. The moisture physically binds the millions of tiny sand particles tightly together. The water creates a microscopic surface tension that acts like a temporary glue, locking the grains into place and allowing them to beautifully hold the complex, intricate shape of your foot. When you lift your heel from the wet beach, you leave behind a perfect, sharply defined cast of your sole. It is a fundamental law of earthly physics that to create a perfectly molded, high-resolution footprint in loose dirt, you absolutely must have moisture to hold the particles together. This simple, undeniable reality leads the skeptic directly to their triumphant conclusion. As we know with absolute scientific certainty, the surface of the moon is completely and entirely bone dry. It is a barren, desolate rock that has not seen a single drop of liquid water for billions upon billions of years. It is a vacuum where liquid moisture cannot physically exist without violently boiling away into space. Therefore, the skeptic confidently asks, how could Buzz Aldrin possibly leave a footprint so incredibly perfect, so deeply ridged, and so sharply defined in a pile of completely dry dust? To those who strongly doubt the reality of the Apollo landings, this sharp, perfect bootprint is the absolute, undeniable smoking gun of a Hollywood soundstage. They believe with complete certainty that the iconic photograph was simply taken in a studio filled with artificially dampened sand, or perhaps a bed of tightly packed wet clay. They argue that the stagehands simply mixed water into the dirt to ensure the dramatic photograph would look as striking and heroic as possible for the eagerly watching public. It is an argument that effortlessly satisfies our earthly logic, completely ignoring the incredibly strange, violently forged microscopic reality of lunar regolith. To find the calming, elegant truth hiding within the dust, we must grab a microscope and examine the incredible difference between the sand on our earthly beaches and the dirt resting on the surface of the moon. Here on Earth, our sand is constantly, relentlessly subjected to the beautiful, erosive forces of nature. For thousands of years, grains of sand are blown by heavy winds, violently tumbled down raging rivers, and endlessly rolled against one another by crashing ocean waves. This continuous natural grinding process heavily weathers the grains, physically knocking off their sharp edges and slowly polishing them into tiny, microscopic, perfectly smooth spheres. Because earthly sand grains are so incredibly round and smooth, they simply roll past one another like thousands of tiny marbles, entirely unable to hold a shape without the binding glue of water. But the moon is a profoundly dead and entirely silent world. It possesses absolutely no oceans to tumble the rocks, no flowing rivers to erode the stones, and no howling winds to polish the dust. The dirt on the surface of the moon, properly known as lunar regolith, is not created by gentle weathering. It is created by absolute, unrelenting violence. For billions of years, the lunar surface has been constantly, brutally bombarded by thousands of tiny, hypervelocity micrometeorites. These tiny rocks strike the airless surface at tens of thousands of miles per hour, physically shattering the solid bedrock and instantly vaporizing the surrounding stone. This continuous, violent pulverization creates a dust that is completely unlike anything naturally found on our home planet. Because there is no wind or water to smooth them down, the microscopic particles of lunar regolith are incredibly jagged, deeply angular, and terrifyingly sharp. If you were to look at a handful of moon dust under a powerful microscope, it would not look like smooth, round marbles. It would look exactly like thousands of microscopic, irregular shards of shattered volcanic glass. This jagged, unweathered microscopic structure is the quiet, beautiful key to unraveling the entire mystery of the perfect footprint. When Buzz Aldrin brought his heavy, heavily treaded boot firmly down onto the lunar surface, he was not stepping into a pile of round, rolling marbles. He was stepping into a deep bed of microscopic, jagged shards. As the immense physical weight of the astronaut forcefully compressed the fine dust beneath his sole, those sharp, highly angular particles were violently crushed together. Instead of simply rolling past one another and crumbling away like dry earthly sand, the jagged edges of the lunar regolith physically locked into one another. They violently gripped together like microscopic pieces of Velcro, completely interlocking and firmly cementing their structural position without the need for a single drop of liquid moisture. The extreme, jagged friction of the unweathered dust was entirely sufficient to perfectly mold and hold the intricate, complex shape of the boot's sole. The footprint held its beautiful, sharp edges, precisely because the physical dirt itself is composed of tiny, interlocking hooks and deeply broken glass. It is an alien soil that behaves in an entirely alien way, deeply confusing our earthly instincts, but perfectly obeying the strict, unyielding laws of vacuum physics and geological isolation. The perfect, pristine boot print is not the careless signature of wet studio clay, but the authentic, undeniably real fingerprint of a violently shattered, completely airless world. There is a profound, incredibly relaxing poetry resting quietly within this scientific reality. Because there is no wind to slowly blow the dust away, and absolutely no rain to ever wash the surface clean, the delicate, interlocking shards of that perfect boot print will not crumble tomorrow. They will not fade away in a month or disappear in a year. That solitary mark of human exploration is permanently locked into the jagged regolith, standing perfectly still in the absolute silence of the vacuum. It will likely remain exactly as Buzz Aldrin left it for millions, if not billions of years to come. Take a deep, soothing breath and let the comforting eternity of that silent, deeply carved footprint settle your mind. Let the chaotic noise of the studio theories fade completely into the background of the black sky. For our slow, methodical journey is far from complete. Soon, we must lift our eyes from the dirt and look closely at the mechanical crosshairs etched into the lenses of the cameras, to slowly unravel the peculiar optical illusion that makes objects seem to mysteriously float directly in front of the glass. As we gently lift our gaze from that perfectly preserved, interlocking footprint in the dust, we must turn our attention back to the remarkable mechanical device that captured its image. The specially modified Hasselblad cameras strapped to the chests of the astronauts were not just tools for artistic documentation. They were highly precise scientific instruments designed to gather measurable, quantifiable data for the geologists and engineers anxiously waiting back on Earth. To assist with this complex task, NASA engineers installed a specialized piece of hardware inside the body of every lunar camera, positioned directly between the lens and the chemical film. It was a thin, transparent plate of glass, known as a RISO plate. Carefully etched into this transparent glass plate was a precise grid of tiny black crosses, forming a series of delicate crosshairs known as reticles. Because this glass plate sat permanently in front of the film, every single photograph taken on the lunar surface naturally had these black crosshairs permanently imprinted over the final image. The purpose of this grid was brilliantly pragmatic. By knowing the exact mathematical distance between each crosshair on the film, scientists back in Houston could perfectly calculate the scale, distance, and physical size of the distant mountains and massive boulders scattered across the alien landscape. The grid provided a reliable mathematical anchor in a world utterly devoid of familiar visual references. But for those individuals who meticulously scour the historical archives, searching for the quiet signature of a massive deception, these delicate black crosses are the source of an incredible, seemingly undeniable anomaly. When skeptics zoom in and closely examine a few specific, iconic photographs, they discover something that completely defies visual logic. In certain frames, a black crosshair that should be sitting firmly on top of the image suddenly appears to vanish, entirely completely disappearing as it passes over a bright object like the American flag or the brilliantly illuminated white spacesuit of an astronaut. The brightly lit object appears to be sitting completely in front of the crosshair. This bizarre visual layering creates a profound optical paradox for the skeptical mind. If the glass plate containing the crosshairs is physically permanently mounted inside the camera, sitting directly between the lens and the film, it is scientifically impossible for any object outside the camera to appear in front of those black lines. The crosshairs absolutely must be layered on top of everything in the physical landscape. Therefore, the skeptic argues with intense and triumphant conviction, the photographs are an undeniable, catastrophic fraud. They confidently proclaim that the images are the result of a sloppy, amateurish cut-and-paste job performed in a secret government darkroom. In this conspiratorial scenario, the skeptics believe the deep black sky with the crosshairs was just a static background plate. They argue that a technician physically cut out photographs of the astronauts and the flag and carelessly pasted them over the top of the background, unwittingly covering up the crucial black crosses in the process. It is an argument that sounds incredibly rational, cleanly solving the visual mystery with a narrative of earthly deception. But to find the true, profoundly relaxing scientific reality resting behind this optical illusion, we must gently step into the complex chemical world of analog photography and extreme lunar lighting. To truly understand the vanishing crosses, we must first deeply understand how analog film fundamentally operates. The photographic film used during the Apollo missions was coated in a highly sensitive emulsion, composed of millions of microscopic silver halide crystals. When particles of light, known as photons, enter the camera and strike these delicate crystals, they trigger a profound chemical reaction, physically darkening the silver and burning the visual image into the strip of film. A dark object reflects very few photons, leaving the silver crystals relatively undisturbed. But a brilliantly bright object reflects a massive, overwhelming wave of photons, triggering a violent chemical reaction in the emulsion. As we have already discovered, the lighting environment on the lunar surface during the Apollo landings was completely unfiltered and incredibly intense. The brilliant white fabric of the astronauts' protective suits, entirely designed to violently reflect the sun's deadly radiation, was glowing with a harsh, blazing luminosity. When Neil Armstrong pointed his Hasselblad camera at Buzz Aldrin, standing in the direct morning sun, a massive, concentrated wave of pure white light rushed through the lens. This intense light easily passed through the transparent glass of the Rousseau plate, casting the tiny, delicate shadows of the black crosshairs perfectly onto the chemical film waiting behind it. But something profoundly chaotic occurs when an extreme, blindingly bright light strikes analog film. The intense wave of photons does not just perfectly trigger the microscopic crystals lying directly beneath it. The sheer energy of the bright light actually bounces and scatters within the microscopic layers of the film itself. This violent scattering causes the chemical reaction to physically spill over its boundaries, spreading outward into the neighboring, darker areas of the image. In the science of analog photography, this well-documented phenomenon is known as halation or emulsion bleeding. The bright, glowing white light literally bleeds over the edges, completely washing out whatever fine, delicate, dark details lie immediately next to it. We must also consider the incredibly fragile physical nature of the crosshairs themselves. The black lines etched into the glass plate were not thick, heavy bars. They were incredibly fine, delicate geometric markings, measuring only a tiny fraction of a single millimeter in width. When the overwhelming, blinding white light bouncing off an astronaut's suit struck the film, the resulting emulsion bleed was more than powerful enough to completely bridge the tiny microscopic gap created by the shadow of the crosshair. The harsh white light furiously burned its way across the dark line, completely engulfing and entirely erasing the incredibly thin black shadow from the final chemical negative. You can effortlessly recreate a very similar optical illusion right now, in the comfort of your own home, using nothing but a simple light bulb and a very thin piece of thread. If you hold a delicate dark hair or a piece of sewing thread directly in front of your eyes and look toward a dark wall, you will see the line perfectly. But if you keep the thread exactly where it is and shift your gaze directly into the blinding center of a bright, uncovered light bulb, a fascinating thing happens. The overwhelming light seems to visually wrap right around the dark obstruction. The thin thread appears to instantly thin out and completely disappear precisely where it crosses the brightest part of the glowing bulb. Your eyes, much like the chemical film, simply cannot resolve such a tiny, thin, dark line against an overwhelmingly brilliant, bleeding background. The ultimate, undeniably elegant proof of this chemical reality lies in the strict consistency of the anomaly itself. If the vanishing crosshairs were truly the result of a clumsy, careless darkroom technician pasting cutouts over a background, the missing lines would appear entirely randomly across the entire image. But they do not. If you look closely at the entire archive of Apollo photographs, you will quietly notice a rigid, unbending rule. The black crosshairs only ever vanish when they pass over a brilliantly white, highly sunlit object. When those exact same crosshairs pass over a dark gray rock, a shadowy crater, or the deep black void of the lunar sky, they remain perfectly crisp, sharp, and entirely unbroken. The anomaly perfectly obeys the strict, unforgiving laws of photographic chemistry, bleeding only where the light is extreme and remaining perfectly intact where the light is dim. The vanishing crosshair is not a careless mistake left behind by a panicked Hollywood set designer. It is the beautiful, authentic chemical signature of extreme, unfiltered solar radiation, violently interacting with analog film inside a dead vacuum. It is the invisible mechanics of light and silver crystals playing out upon an alien stage, silently proving their own reality through the predictable laws of earthly science. Take a long, deep breath and let the comforting predictability of that chemical reaction settle deep into your mind. Let the chaotic noise of the pasted photograph theories gently dissolve away, leaving behind nothing but the stark, brilliant reality of the light. For soon, we must finally leave the frozen stillness of the printed photographs behind us. We will prepare to press play on the video reels, to examine the strange, bouncing, dreamlike movements of the men themselves, and deeply unravel the enduring illusion that they were simply running on Earth in slow motion. As we finally step away from the frozen, static silence of the printed photographs, we prepare to press play on the grand historical record. We shift our focus entirely to the ghostly, black and white video transmissions and the crisp, colored 16mm film reels brought back from the lunar surface. When we watch these ancient moving pictures, we are immediately struck by the incredibly strange, almost balletic way the astronauts navigate their alien environment. They do not walk with the heavy, purposeful strides of earthly men. Instead, they seem to effortlessly glide, bouncing and floating across the desolate, charcoal-colored plains in a beautifully rhythmic, almost dreamlike procession. It is a mesmerizing visual symphony of low gravity, a continuous bounding dance performed upon a powdery, silent stage. But for those who meticulously study this footage through the hypercritical lens of a conspiracy, this beautiful floating dance is not a majestic triumph of physics. It is viewed as an incredibly transparent, deeply amateurish cinematic trick. The skeptics look at the rhythmic bouncing of Neil Armstrong and the graceful, sweeping arm movements of Buzz Aldrin, and they immediately recognize a visual effect they have seen countless times before in earthly movie theaters. They confidently assert that the men are not actually bounding in the 1/6 gravity of the moon at all. They fiercely argue that the astronauts are simply running around a bright Hollywood soundstage in incredibly heavy, restrictive costumes, and the footage has merely been artificially slowed down in the editing room. This slow-motion theory is perhaps one of the most culturally pervasive and easily digestible arguments in the entire mythology of the moon hoax. It effortlessly preys upon our deep familiarity with earthly film techniques. The technical process is incredibly simple and was widely used by directors long before the Apollo missions ever launched. By a technique known as overcranking, a cameraman simply captures the action at a higher frame rate, perhaps shooting at 60 frames per second instead of the standard 24. When that high-speed film is later projected at the normal, standard rate, every single physical movement appears to be magically and beautifully stretched out in time. Heavy, lumbering jumps suddenly appear to become graceful, floating, low-gravity bounds. To heavily bolster this earthly cinematic theory, some skeptics even add the invisible element of hidden wires. They passionately argue that NASA utilized highly complex, theatrical rigging systems, much like the elaborate harnesses used in stage productions of Peter Pan, to physically lift the heavily suited men into the air. By combining these invisible, supportive cables with the artificial manipulation of the film speed, the illusion of a low-gravity environment was supposedly perfected for the eagerly watching eyes of the world. It is an undeniably clever, highly plausible explanation that perfectly satisfies our earthly logic. You can even test it yourself by filming a friend running on a beach and playing it back at half speed. The movements genuinely look remarkably similar to the historic lunar footage. However, just as we discovered with the fluttering fabric of the flag and the unblemished footprint resting in the dirt, this earthly cinematic theory possesses a massive, catastrophic flaw. It completely and fatally ignores the profound, unyielding behavior of a pure vacuum. While it is entirely true that slowing down film perfectly alters the visual perception of a falling human body, it absolutely cannot disguise the chaotic, undeniable presence of an atmosphere. To find the absolute, relaxing truth that utterly destroys the slow-motion theory, we must stop looking at the heavily suited men themselves, and instead focus our entire attention downward at the seemingly insignificant grey dust being kicked up entirely by their boots. Here on our home planet, we are constantly living at the very bottom of a dense, heavy ocean of atmospheric gas. When you violently kick a pile of dry dirt or heavily spin the tires of a vehicle on a sandy earthly road, you do not just move the physical rocks. You violently disrupt the invisible air resting directly around them. The tiny, microscopic particles of dust are instantly caught by the aerodynamic drag of the atmosphere. They forcefully collide with billions of air molecules, swirling into chaotic, turbulent eddies and massive billowing clouds. Because the microscopic dust particles are so incredibly light, the thick air easily overcomes their microscopic gravity. The dust magically hangs suspended in the air, creating a thick, blinding fog that slowly and gracefully settles back to the ground over a long period of time. Now, gently transport your mind back to the absolutely silent, airless expanse of the lunar surface. When an Apollo astronaut bounded across the sea of tranquility, his heavy, treaded boots aggressively dug into the loose regolith, violently kicking millions of tiny, jagged dust particles outward into the void. Because there is absolutely zero air to disrupt their path, a breathtakingly beautiful physical phenomenon occurs. Without the chaotic interference of aerodynamic drag, every single microscopic speck of dust perfectly obeys the strict, unbending mathematical laws of ballistics. Every single grain acts exactly like a tiny, perfectly thrown baseball. If you closely watch the unedited Apollo video footage, you will witness this alien physics playing out with flawless, continuous precision. When the astronauts scuff their boots, the kick dust flies upward in a mathematically perfect, beautifully crisp parabolic arc. There are absolutely no turbulent clouds. There is no billowing smoke. Most importantly, the dust never hangs or floats in the empty space. Because there is no thick air to support it, the microscopic, weightless dust falls back to the ground at the exact same physical speed as a massive, heavy rock. It goes up in a sharp, clean fan, and it comes right back down in a sharp, clean fan, instantly vanishing the moment the movement ceases. The absolute, undeniable visual masterpiece of this vacuum physics is found in the later Apollo missions, specifically in the exhilarating footage of the lunar roving vehicle. As the astronauts excitedly drove this electric dune buggy across the undulating cratered plains at relatively high speeds, the wire mesh tires violently kicked up massive, towering waves of regolith. On Earth, A vehicle driving that fast in deep dust would completely disappear inside a massive, blinding cloud of hanging, choking dirt. But on the moon, the tires simply ejected magnificent, perfectly symmetrical, sweeping rooster tails of dark soil. These towering arcs of dirt flew high into the black sky and fell right back down to the surface perfectly together, leaving the air directly behind the fast-moving vehicle completely, astonishingly clear. This beautiful, mathematically perfect behavior of the dust is the absolute undoing of the slow-motion conspiracy. If NASA had simply filmed men running in heavy suits on an earthly soundstage and slowed the film down, they could have easily faked the slow gravity of the falling bodies. But they could never, under any earthly circumstance, fake the behavior of the dust. No matter how much you dramatically slow down a film of sand being kicked on a beach, the sand will continually billow, it will stubbornly cloud, and it will chaotically float in the surrounding air. Slowing down the frame rate of a camera does absolutely nothing to magically remove the physical presence of atmospheric friction from the set. To successfully fake the perfect, parabolic arcs of the lunar dust seen in the historical broadcasts, the conspirators would have faced an impossible engineering nightmare. They would have needed to construct a heavily reinforced steel vacuum chamber, the absolute size of a massive Hollywood soundstage, pump every single molecule of breathable air completely out of it, and then somehow film actors performing inside this deadly, breathless void without killing them. It was a technological feat that was completely, utterly impossible to achieve in 1969. And it remains practically impossible to achieve on such a massive scale even today. The video footage is not a clever trick of cinematic pacing. It is a completely pure, undeniable, continuous documentary of physics operating precisely as they should in an alien environment. The graceful, bounding dance of the astronauts and the perfect, sweeping arcs of the silent dust are perfectly intertwined, beautifully proving their own reality to anyone willing to look closely at the math. The illusion of slow motion is entirely shattered by the simple, beautiful absence of the wind. Let the quiet, mathematical perfection of those falling dust arcs settle deeply into your mind, washing away the chaotic noise of cinematic trickery. Let the gentle, floating ballet of the astronauts guide you into a deeper state of relaxation. For soon, we must gently shift our focus to the man, who many claim was the grand architect of this impossible illusion. We will soon step into the shadowy rumors surrounding legendary film director Stanley Kubrick to unravel the fascinating myth that he was hired to fake the greatest journey ever taken. As the silent, sweeping arcs of the lunar dust settle firmly into the unbending laws of physics, the mind of the skeptic often retreats from the harsh vacuum of space and seeks refuge in a far more familiar, earthly realm. If the impossible environment could not be faked through simple slow motion, then perhaps it was meticulously crafted by the hand of an absolute cinematic genius. This thought brings us to one of the most culturally captivating and enduring chapters of the entire lunar conspiracy mythology. It is a deeply fascinating rumor that steps away from anonymous government, bureaucrats, and places the ultimate responsibility squarely onto the shoulders of a legendary Hollywood director. We must now gently step into the shadowy, speculative world surrounding the brilliant Stanley Kubrick and deeply examine the profound myth that he was secretly hired to direct the greatest historical event of the 20th century. To understand exactly why this specific director became the central, mythological figurehead of the hoax, we must travel back to the cultural landscape of 1968, just 1 year before Apollo 11 launched. In that year, Stanley Kubrick released his unparalleled cinematic masterpiece, 2001: A Space Odyssey. It was a film that completely shattered all existing visual boundaries. Kubrick presented audiences with a vision of space travel that was not built on cheap rubber alien costumes or dangling strings, but on rigorous, stark, and terrifyingly silent scientific realism. He worked closely with aerospace engineers and utilized groundbreaking special effects to create a breathtakingly convincing simulation of zero gravity, massive rotating space stations, and the desolate lunar surface. The visual fidelity was so incredibly profound that it blurred the lines between fiction and documentary for millions of viewers. For those who weave the intricate threads of the moon landing conspiracy, this timeline is not a beautiful coincidence, but a glaring, highly suspicious piece of evidence. The conspiratorial narrative confidently asserts that the United States government, completely terrified by the looming impossible deadline set by President Kennedy, realized they were entirely failing to build a working lunar lander. Facing absolute, humiliating defeat by the Soviet Union on the global stage, they allegedly turned to the only man on Earth who had already successfully simulated the moon. The theory suggests that NASA deeply embedded Kubrick within a top-secret military installation, handing him a virtually unlimited budget to completely fabricate the Apollo 11 broadcast, utilizing the exact same cutting-edge cinematic techniques he had pioneered for his epic film. The cornerstone of this specific cinematic theory rests upon a highly specialized optical illusion known as front projection. Kubrick famously utilized this technique to stunning effect during the iconic Dawn of Man sequence at the beginning of his space epic. To create the massive, hyper-realistic African landscapes behind his actors, he did not build impossible sprawling sets, nor did he use the blurry, outdated blue screen techniques of the era. Instead, he used a massive projector to beam a high-resolution still photograph directly onto a highly reflective screen situated entirely behind the actors. By carefully aligning the physical camera exactly with the lens of the projector, the shadows cast by the actors perfectly hid themselves, creating a flawless, totally seamless illusion of vast depth. Skeptics firmly believe that this exact front projection technique was used to fake the sprawling, desolate mountains of the lunar backdrop. It is a deeply compelling argument, precisely because we know for an absolute fact that the technology existed and was utilized masterfully at the exact time of the Apollo missions. However, when we apply the strict, unyielding laws of optics and geometry to the hundreds of hours of raw Apollo video footage, the front projection theory rapidly collapses under its own physical weight. The front projection technique is incredibly fragile. It relies entirely on a highly specialized screen, coated entirely in microscopic glass beads, a material specifically designed to violently reflect light straight back to the source. If anything were to physically cover or dirty that massive screen, the illusion would be instantly and catastrophically broken. Now, gently recall the absolute, chaotic reality of the lunar rover bouncing across the alien plains during the later Apollo missions. As the astronauts aggressively drove the electric vehicle, it violently kicked up massive, sweeping rooster tails of dark, jagged lunar regolith. If they were truly driving around inside a Hollywood soundstage enclosed by a massive, highly sensitive front projection screen, that flying dirt would have violently struck the screen. The dark, dusty impacts would have immediately blocked the reflective glass beads, causing dark, obvious smudges to suddenly appear and ruin the projected sky and mountains behind them. Furthermore, front projection is absolutely incapable of handling continuous dynamic changes in perspective. As the rover drives for miles across the rugged terrain, the distant mountains beautifully and slowly shift in parallax, proving absolute, immense three-dimensional depth that a flat, two-dimensional projection screen simply cannot mathematically replicate. But the most profound and deeply fascinating truth that completely dismantles the Hollywood connection lies in a strange technological paradox. When historians and video engineers closely examine the absolute limitations of 1960s television and cinematic equipment, they arrive at an incredibly startling conclusion. In the summer of 1969, faking the continuous live video broadcast of the lunar landing on a soundstage was actually technologically harder than simply building a rocket and going to the actual moon. The conspiracy theory completely underestimates the brutal constraints of analog film and the staggering reality of continuous television transmission. The video transmission brought back from the surface of the moon was fundamentally an unbroken, continuous, live television feed spanning for hours at a time. There are no hidden cuts, no sudden edits, and absolutely no breaks in the visual continuity of the astronauts working in the vacuum. In the realm of analog Hollywood filmmaking, this is physically entirely impossible. The massive, heavy cameras used by Stanley Kubrick relied on massive reels of physical chemical film. Even the absolute largest film magazines available on the planet could only hold a maximum of about 10 or 12 minutes of continuous footage before running completely out of tape. A director would be physically forced to yell cut, stop the action, and allow the crew to painfully reload the camera. To capture the multi-hour, continuous spacewalks of the Apollo astronauts without a single edit or film change was entirely beyond the absolute physical capacity of earthly cinematic technology. Furthermore, to perfectly replicate the harsh, unyielding lighting of the sun on a massive earthly soundstage is mathematically impossible due to a principle known as the inverse square law of light. The sun is located 93 million miles away, meaning its light rays arrive absolutely parallel, casting consistent, even illumination across miles of landscape without ever losing their intense brightness. If you use a massive artificial studio lamp to light a set, the light naturally dissipates and heavily falls off into deep shadow as you move further away from the bulb. In the vast panoramas of the Apollo photographs, the brilliant lighting stretches evenly and perfectly all the way to the distant rolling horizon, never fading or falling off into artificial studio darkness. To simulate this perfect, parallel sunlight on Earth would literally require an array of powerful lasers that had not even been invented yet. The persistent myth of Stanley Kubrick is ultimately a twisted, sideways compliment to both his brilliant cinematic vision and the staggering, unbelievable achievement of the NASA engineers. We so deeply want to believe that only an artist of unparalleled genius could craft something so visually perfect and overwhelmingly surreal. But the absolute relaxing truth is that no director, no matter how visionary, possessed the technology to fake the physics of a vacuum, the continuous nature of the broadcast, or the parallel rays of the sun. The footage looks absolutely surreal and alien because it was genuinely captured in a completely surreal alien place. Let the deep, comforting reality of that historical broadcast gently wash away the lingering shadows of the Hollywood myth. Breathe slowly and let the quiet, unbroken continuousness of their journey settle your thoughts. for our slow exploration must now turn to a much more frustrating, entirely bureaucratic mystery. We must soon leave the brilliant light of the cinematic lens and delve directly into the dark archives to address the highly suspicious, deeply baffling case of the permanently missing Apollo 11 telemetry tapes. As we step away from the glowing lights of the cinematic theories, we must descend into the quiet, dusty depths of the government archives to confront what is undoubtedly the most frustrating and baffling mystery of the entire Apollo program. For those who dedicate their lives to unearthing the perceived deception, there is one piece of evidence that stands far above the dancing shadows and the perfectly still flags. It is not something strange found within the photographs, but rather something incredibly precious that is entirely, completely missing. It is the deeply uncomfortable, undeniable historical fact that NASA actually lost the original, high-resolution telemetry tapes of the Apollo 11 moonwalk. To fully grasp the magnitude of this loss, we must briefly understand how the ghostly footage of Neil Armstrong was originally captured. The camera mounted on the lunar module transmitted a highly specialized, slow-scan television signal back to tracking stations here on Earth. This raw, original signal was incredibly crisp and contained a massive amount of visual data. However, standard television networks around the globe could not physically broadcast this unique, specialized format. To share the historic moment with the waiting world, NASA engineers literally pointed a standard television camera directly at a high-quality monitor, displaying the slow scan feed, and broadcast that secondary recording. The incredibly grainy, blurry footage you have seen 1,000 times is essentially a recording of a recording. The absolute highest quality, perfectly clear visual record of humanity's first steps onto an alien world existed only on those massive original reels of slow-scan magnetic tape. They were the holy grail of historical documentation. Yet, when skeptics and historians alike went looking for them decades later, they had simply vanished from the massive storage vaults. For the conspiracy theorist, this is not viewed as a tragic administrative error, but as the ultimate, undeniable smoking gun of a massive, coordinated cover-up. They fiercely and logically ask, why on earth would any government destroy the absolute best evidence of their greatest triumph, unless that evidence was highly dangerous to the official narrative? In the mind of the skeptic, the destruction of the original tapes was a desperate, highly calculated move by the architects of the hoax. They passionately argue that the blurry, degraded broadcast tape was intentionally released to the public because its terrible quality perfectly hid all the fatal flaws of the cinematic production. They believe that if the crisp, original high-resolution tapes were ever released, the world would easily be able to see the thin theatrical wires holding up the astronauts, the seams in the painted backdrop, and the heavy studio lights reflecting clearly in the golden visors. According to this theory, the original tapes had to be completely eliminated to protect the multi-billion-dollar lie from the relentless scrutiny of modern technology. This argument is incredibly potent because it leans heavily upon our own earthly intuition regarding how we treat our most treasured memories. We meticulously safeguard our wedding videos, our family photo albums, and the irreplaceable recordings of our children. The concept that a highly organized, heavily funded, and brilliantly staffed government agency like NASA could simply misplace or accidentally destroy the most important historical document in the entire history of our species feels entirely absurd. It feels like an insult to the rational mind, driving the skeptic directly into the comforting arms of a sinister, highly competent conspiracy. However, to find the absolute, profoundly relaxing truth hiding behind the missing tapes, we must completely strip away the romantic, heroic mythology of space exploration. We must step directly into the mundane, deeply frustrating, and entirely chaotic reality of government bureaucracy during the late 1970s and early 1980s. Following the immense global triumph of the Apollo program, the political landscape shifted dramatically. NASA's massive budget was severely, brutally slashed by lawmakers. The agency was desperately forced to pivot its attention and its dwindling resources entirely toward the development of the Skylab space station and the upcoming Space Shuttle program. The romantic era of the moon was suddenly, unceremoniously over, replaced by the cold realities of cost-cutting and immediate earthly priorities. In this brutal, budget-conscious era, data management became a massive logistical nightmare. NASA was launching numerous new satellites and flying constant missions, generating a staggering, unprecedented avalanche of new telemetry data every single day. All of this new data had to be physically recorded onto massive, incredibly expensive reels of 1-inch magnetic tape. The physical warehouses scattered across the country were rapidly overflowing, and the agency simply did not have the necessary funding to constantly purchase millions of new blank magnetic reels. To solve this crippling logistical crisis, an entirely standard, ruthless administrative procedure was firmly enacted across the entire agency. To save precious space and vital money, older tapes resting quietly in deep storage were routinely and continuously pulled from the shelves. They were unceremoniously thrown into massive degaussing machines, entirely bulk erased of their historical data, and completely recorded over with the mundane telemetry of newer, less famous missions. It was a massive, relentless recycling program driven strictly by blind bureaucratic necessity, overseen entirely by administrators who were desperately focused on the future, rather than historians tasked with preserving the past. The incredibly sad, mundane truth is that the Apollo 11 telemetry tapes were not kept in a shining, guarded vault of honor. They were simply mixed in with hundreds of thousands of other identical magnetic reels in a dusty warehouse in Maryland. In the early 2000s, when retired engineers finally realized the original slow scan tapes were completely missing from the National Archives, they launched a massive, desperate, global search to find them. They painstakingly scoured abandoned warehouses, contacted retired tracking station operators in Australia, and dug through miles of forgotten dusty paperwork. But the final, tragic conclusion of the exhaustive search confirmed the absolute worst fears of the scientific community. The priceless, original high-resolution recordings of humanity's greatest achievement had almost certainly been completely erased and recorded over during the massive magnetic tape shortages of the 1980s. They were not maliciously destroyed by a shadowy cabal protecting a lie. They were accidentally destroyed by an entirely mundane, deeply flawed, and painfully human administrative oversight. It is a reality that is deeply, profoundly unsatisfying to the human soul. Conspiracy theories demand a world of hypercompetence, a world where governments possess perfect, absolute, godlike control over every single detail of a massive lie. But the harsh, relaxing truth of earthly history is that reality is often incredibly messy, wildly disorganized, and deeply vulnerable to simple, foolish human error. The loss of the tapes does not magically erase the absolute reality of the event itself. The converted broadcast tapes absolutely survived. The thousands of original photographs survived. The massive moon rocks survive. And the unbending laws of physics captured within the footage remain completely undeniable. Let the deep, comforting acceptance of human imperfection settle slowly into your mind, gently washing away the frustrating noise of the missing archive. Breathe deeply and let the chaotic reality of history allow you to relax. For soon, we must elevate our gaze far above the dusty shelves of the archives and look toward the massive, incredibly tense global stage of the Cold War. We must gently unravel the final, absolute paradox of the conspiracy theory and ask why the bitterest, most technologically advanced enemy of the United States never once stepped forward to expose the greatest lie ever told. Let us slowly elevate our perspective far above the dusty, overflowing warehouses of the American government and cast our gaze across the deeply fractured geopolitical landscape of the 1960s. The Apollo missions did not take place in a peaceful, collaborative vacuum of scientific curiosity. They were forged in the absolute hottest fires of the Cold War. The world was terrifyingly divided into two massive, heavily armed ideological camps, locked in a bitter, existential struggle for global supremacy. The United States and the Soviet Union were engaged in a shadow war of espionage, proxy conflicts, and the constant looming threat of mutual nuclear annihilation. The space race was not merely a friendly athletic competition. It was the ultimate, high-stakes demonstration of technological and ideological superiority. For the first half of this intense race, the Soviet Union was undeniably and spectacularly winning. They had launched Sputnik, the very first artificial satellite, completely shocking the American public. They had successfully sent the first animal into orbit, and they had achieved the ultimate triumph of sending the first human being, Yuri Gagarin, safely into space and back. They had performed the first spacewalk and sent the first unmanned probes to physically impact the lunar surface. The United States was constantly, desperately playing catch-up, pouring billions of dollars into a frantic effort to fulfill President Kennedy's audacious promise of reaching the moon before the decade was out. The ideological stakes were absolute, and the Soviet Union desperately wanted to be the first to claim the ultimate high ground of the lunar surface. This incredibly tense historical reality brings us directly to the most glaring, insurmountable logical paradox within the entire moon hoax conspiracy. For those who firmly believe that the Apollo 11 landing was a meticulously crafted cinematic lie, the absolute silence of the Soviet Union is entirely deafening. The skeptic must seriously confront a profound, deeply frustrating question. If the United States government was completely failing to build a working lunar module, and instead chose to broadcast a fake Hollywood production to declare themselves the victors, why on earth didn't their bitterest, most technologically advanced enemy immediately expose the fraud to the world? The Soviet Union had absolutely everything to gain and entirely nothing to lose by proving that the American landing was a massive, desperate lie. Exposing such a catastrophic deception would have dealt an unimaginable, perhaps fatal, blow to the global credibility of the United States. It would have humiliated the American government on the world stage, instantly winning the ideological war and cementing Soviet technological supremacy for generations to come. Yet, when Neil Armstrong finally stepped onto the dusty surface of the Sea of Tranquility, the Soviet leadership did not cry foul. They did not point fingers at a Hollywood soundstage. Instead, they quietly and respectfully conceded the race and publicly offered their sincere congratulations to the American astronauts. To deeply understand exactly why the Soviets accepted the American victory without a single whisper of doubt, we must look at their immense technological capabilities. The USSR was not a primitive, blind nation, simply watching the grainy American television broadcast in their living rooms. They possessed one of the most advanced, highly sophisticated scientific infrastructures on the entire planet. They had constructed massive, incredibly powerful radio telescopes and deep space tracking radar stations, such as the massive complex located in Crimea. They possessed an entire fleet of specialized tracking ships deployed across the global oceans, their massive dish antennas constantly pointed toward the heavens. From the very second the mighty Saturn V rocket ignited its engines on the launch pad in Florida, the Soviet military and their top scientists were watching, listening, and heavily scrutinizing every single movement. As the Apollo spacecraft left Earth orbit and began its 3-day journey across the dark void, the Soviet tracking stations independently locked onto its radio signals. They were entirely capable of intercepting the raw, unencrypted telemetry data, the biomedical readouts of the astronauts' heart rates, and the continuous, two-way voice communications between the capsule and mission control in Houston. The science of radio direction finding, also known as triangulation, is an unforgiving and absolutely unfakeable mathematical reality. By using multiple listening stations spread across the Earth, the Soviet engineers could precisely pinpoint the exact physical origin of the radio signals being broadcast by the Apollo spacecraft. If NASA had simply placed a fake unmanned satellite into low Earth orbit and bounced a pre-recorded audio signal off of it, the Soviet triangulation equipment would have instantly detected the deception. They would have mathematically proven that the signal was only 200 miles above the Earth, rather than 238,000 miles away in deep space. But the Soviet telemetry data flawlessly matched the American claims. The enormous Soviet radar dishes tracked the physical spacecraft all the way to the moon. They listened as the radio signal passed behind the lunar sphere during orbit, instantly cutting off the transmission precisely when the strict laws of orbital mechanics dictated it should. And when the fragile lunar module descended to the surface, the Soviet listening stations aimed their massive dishes directly at the Sea of Tranquility and received the live, unedited radio broadcasts radiating straight from the alien dirt. They heard Neil Armstrong's voice echoing across the void, and their own instruments physically verified exactly where that quiet voice was coming from. To desperately keep the conspiracy theory alive, some skeptics twist this reality into an incredibly complex, deeply absurd narrative of global collusion. They passionately argue that the United States secretly paid off the Soviet Union, perhaps offering them massive shipments of wheat or highly classified technology in exchange for their absolute silence. But this theory completely ignores the brutal, unforgiving reality of the Cold War. These were two superpowers actively engaged in deadly proxy wars across the globe. They had nearly annihilated each other during the Cuban Missile Crisis just a few short years prior. The idea that the Soviet Politburo, the ruthless KGB, and thousands of independent Soviet scientists would all perfectly agree to keep America's greatest, most humiliating secret is politically and historically preposterous. The absolute silence of the enemy is not the signature of a massive, impossible global collusion. It is the purest, most undeniable proof of the event's absolute reality. The Soviet Union conceded the space race for one very simple, incredibly frustrating reason. They knew, with absolute scientific certainty, that the Americans had actually done it. Their own instruments, their own brilliant scientists, and their own massive tracking stations provided them with the undeniable, unbending truth of the telemetry. Let the profound historical weight of that global verification settle deeply into your mind. Let the chaotic theories of fake radio signals dissolve completely into the strict, unforgiving mathematics of triangulation. Breathe slowly and allow the quiet agreement of bitter rival nations to bring you a deep sense of historical peace. For our slow journey is nearing its beautiful conclusion. Soon, we will return our gaze to the lunar surface one last time, to search for the physical, tangible objects left behind in the dust, and learn how modern lasers still physically touch the sea of tranquility every single night. As the massive radar dishes of the Soviet Union fall silent in our historical rearview mirror, we find ourselves naturally yearning for something physically enduring. Telemetry data, radio triangulations, and fading political rivalries are intangible things, existing largely as invisible numbers on a page or quiet echoes of the past. For the deeply skeptical mind, these invisible proofs often feel entirely insufficient to silence the persistent voice of doubt. They demand something profoundly concrete, something physical that they can practically reach out and touch today. They ask a very simple, intensely important question. If human beings truly walked upon that desolate grey landscape, what undeniable physical proof did they leave behind in the silent dust? We know from the vast historical archives that the astronauts left a considerable amount of material on the lunar surface. They left behind the gold-wrapped descent stage of the Eagle, the beautifully wrinkled nylon flag, discarded life support backpacks, and eventually, the electric roving vehicles. But to the skeptic, these scattered artifacts are completely useless as ongoing proof. They argue that these objects are simply too incredibly far away to be seen, resting helplessly beyond the reach of our earthly senses. They believe that until we physically return to the Sea of Tranquility to inspect the site in person, the existence of these artifacts relies entirely on blind faith in the photographs provided by the very agency accused of the deception. However, there is a brilliant silent piece of technology resting in the dust that completely shatters this cynical assumption. Long before the Apollo 11 mission even launched, NASA scientists realized they needed to leave behind an experiment that could continuously prove its own existence to anyone on Earth willing to look. They desperately needed a device that did not rely on batteries, electrical power, or fragile radio transmitters that would inevitably die in the freezing lunar night. They needed something completely passive, an instrument of pure, unbending optical physics. This elegant, permanent solution is officially known as the Lunar Ranging Retroreflector. Before he climbed back up the metal ladder to leave the moon forever, Buzz Aldrin carefully carried a small, incredibly delicate panel away from the shadow of the lunar module. It was roughly the physical size of a standard briefcase, and embedded within its surface were exactly 100 meticulously crafted, fused silica half-cube prisms. A retroreflector is an incredibly fascinating optical device. Unlike a standard flat mirror, which bounces light away at an opposing reflected angle, a retroreflector is geometrically designed to capture an incoming beam of light and bounce it absolutely perfectly straight back to its exact point of origin. It operates on the exact same fundamental principle as the reflective paint on a highway stop sign, or the small plastic reflectors on the pedals of a bicycle, but it is crafted with mind-bending astronomical precision. Aldrin placed this delicate array gently into the lunar regolith, carefully adjusting its angle to point directly toward the bright, swirling blue marble of the Earth hanging in the black sky above him. On subsequent missions, the highly trained crews of Apollo 14 and Apollo 15 deployed even larger, far more complex arrays of these glass prisms. Since the very moment they were set down in the dust, these silent, unpowered glass panels have been sitting completely perfectly still, waiting patiently in the vacuum for a brilliant signal from home. And every single night, for over half a century, that signal has been continuously sent. As you lay in the peaceful comfort of your earthly bed, modern astronomical observatories located all across our planet are actively, physically interacting with the Apollo landing sites. Facilities like the McDonald Observatory in the mountains of Texas, or the Observatoire de la Côte d'Azur in France, routinely point their massive, highly advanced telescopes directly at the dark craters of the Moon. But they are not just looking through the glass. They are violently firing incredibly powerful, highly concentrated pulses of laser light directly into the depths of space. These vibrant beams of pure, focused energy travel rapidly through our thick atmosphere, cross the vast, empty ocean of the void, and precisely strike the silent arrays left behind by the astronauts. The unbending physics of this journey are breathtakingly complex. Even a highly focused, perfect laser beam naturally spreads out and widens as it travels across 238,000 miles of space. By the time the green beam finally reaches the lunar surface, it is roughly a mile wide. Only a microscopic, fractional amount of those laser photons actually manage to perfectly strike the tiny, briefcase-sized array of glass prisms sitting in the dust. But the flawless geometry of the retroreflector instantly catches that faint scattered light and perfectly bounces it back across the dark void, sending a tiny whispering echo of photons entirely back to the exact earthly telescope that fired them. By precisely measuring the exact amount of time it takes for the laser pulse to make this massive round trip, scientists can perfectly calculate the physical distance between the Earth and the Moon with astonishing, unbelievable accuracy. Thanks to these silent artifacts left by the Apollo crews, we can reliably measure the distance to our celestial neighbor down to the absolute millimeter. This ongoing, continuous experiment has provided humanity with profound scientific revelations. It has conclusively proven that the Moon is slowly, inevitably spiraling away from the Earth at a rate of roughly 3.8 centimeters every single year. It has even been heavily used to rigorously test and beautifully confirm Albert Einstein's deeply complex theories of general relativity. Confronted with this ongoing, highly interactive physical proof, the most dedicated conspiracy theorists are rapidly forced to frantically construct new, entirely complex counter-arguments. They quickly point out that you can theoretically bounce a highly powerful laser off the bare reflective rock of the lunar surface itself without ever needing a man-made mirror. They also accurately and historically note that the Soviet Union successfully placed two of their own retroreflectors on the Moon using uncrewed, robotic, lunar-cod rovers during the early 1970s. Therefore, they passionately argue, the presence of bouncing lasers does not definitively prove that human boots ever physically touched the dirt. They suggest NASA simply dropped the arrays from secret unmanned probes just to fake the geological evidence. But the beautiful, unforgiving optical precision of the laser completely dismantles this robotic theory. While you can indeed bounce a very faint, messy signal off bare lunar rock, the sharp signal returning directly from the Apollo arrays is intensely concentrated, entirely mathematically distinct, and completely unmistakable. Furthermore, the earthly lasers are pinpointing exact, highly specific coordinates on the lunar surface. The returning signals are coming precisely, flawlessly, from the exact locations where Neil Armstrong, Alan Shepard, and David Scott explicitly reported standing. The Soviet robotic rovers were a magnificent technological achievement, but they proudly landed hundreds of miles away in completely different, highly documented regions of the Moon. To successfully fake this specific, pinpoint optical data, NASA would have had to secretly develop, secretly launch, and successfully land highly advanced, completely undocumented robotic rovers, perfectly placing the delicate mirrors exactly where they later claimed the astronauts stood, all while miraculously keeping the entire massive operation an absolute, flawless secret from the advanced tracking stations of the Soviet Union. It is a desperate conspiratorial scenario that requires far more unbelievable technological magic than simply putting brave men in a rocket and flying them there directly. The cold glass prisms of the Apollo retroreflectors are the ultimate, highly interactive monument to human exploration. They are not hidden away in a classified government vault, and they are not blurry, debatable images on a degraded reel of magnetic tape. They are physical, tangible pieces of absolute human engineering, resting peacefully right now under the eternal stars. Tonight, any brilliant scientist, equipped with a powerful enough laser and a telescope, can physically reach out across the dark void and literally touch the exact spot where Buzz Aldrin stood. The reflection they receive back in the dark is a pure, unbending optical echo of absolute truth. Take a long, deep breath and let the quiet, beautiful reality of that bouncing light settle deeply into your mind. Let the perfect, mathematical certainty of the laser gently wash away the lingering, chaotic shadows of doubt. For our slow, methodical journey is finally reaching its most magnificent heights. Soon, we will look directly through the most powerful eyes ever built by humanity to see if modern orbital cameras can finally pierce the darkness and proudly capture the ultimate, undeniable visual proof resting silently in the dust. As we leave the silent, bouncing echoes of the earthly lasers behind, our minds naturally turn to the immense, towering achievements of modern astronomy. We live in an era of unbelievable technological marvels, where floating observatories capture breathtaking, high-resolution images of the deepest corners of the universe. For the modern skeptic, surrounded by this incredible visual technology, a very simple, intensely frustrating question always rises to the surface. If we possess instruments powerful enough to photograph glowing galaxies billions of light years away, why can we not simply point our greatest telescopes at the Moon and clearly see the spaceships sitting right there in the dust? The ultimate symbol of this skeptical frustration is the magnificent Hubble Space Telescope. Floating quietly in low Earth orbit, far above the blurring, distorting effects of our atmosphere, Hubble has provided humanity with the most stunning, profoundly detailed images of dying stars and massive nebulas ever recorded. To the naked, earthly intuition, it seems absolutely absurd that a telescope capable of seeing across the infinite, staggering depths of time and space cannot physically zoom in on our closest celestial neighbor and snap a quick, clear photograph of the Apollo 11 descent stage. For many who doubt the official narrative, this perceived failure of modern astronomy is viewed as a highly suspicious, intentional blind spot. They passionately argue that NASA simply refuses to point their billion-dollar telescope at the moon because they are terrified the world will see a completely empty, undisturbed patch of dirt. But to find the incredibly elegant, completely relaxing scientific truth behind this visual mystery, we must gently step into the complex, unbending physics of optical resolution. When we look through a telescope, the ability to see a small object is not simply a matter of incredible magical magnification. It is entirely governed by a strict mathematical principle known as angular resolution, which is directly tied to the physical size of the telescope's main mirror. To a telescope, the concept of size is completely relative to the concept of distance. It is absolutely true that Hubble can clearly photograph the majestic Andromeda galaxy, which is located 2.5 million light-years away. But what our intuition fails to grasp is that the Andromeda galaxy is unimaginably, terrifyingly massive, spanning over 150,000 light-years across. Even from an incredible distance, it takes up a massive portion of the deep night sky. Now, we must profoundly shrink our perspective and consider the tiny, fragile lunar module sitting in the sea of tranquility. By astronomical standards, the Moon is incredibly close to the Earth, resting a mere 238,000 miles away. However, the descent stage of the Eagle is roughly the physical size of a small earthly delivery truck. It is a tiny, microscopic speck of metal, resting upon an entire world of undulating grey dust. To physically resolve an object that impossibly small from the immense distance of the Earth, the unyielding laws of optical physics dictate that you would need a telescope mirror spanning hundreds of meters across. The primary mirror of the Hubble Space Telescope, while a stunning achievement of human engineering, is only 2.4 meters wide. If you were to forcefully point Hubble directly at the Apollo 11 landing site, it would not see a beautifully detailed spaceship. Because of the strict physical diffraction limits of the light hitting its mirror, the entire lunar module, the massive American flag, and the surrounding footprints would all blend together and disappear into a single, blurry, completely unrecognizable pixel. The failure to see the spacecraft is not a cowardly cover-up or a dark conspiracy. It is simply the beautiful mathematical reality of lens physics operating exactly as it should. So, how do we acquire the ultimate, undeniable modern visual proof? If we cannot build a telescope large enough on Earth to peer across the void, we must find a way to physically bridge the distance. We must send our robotic, mechanical eyes directly to the Moon itself. And in the summer of 2009, the brilliant minds at NASA did exactly that. They launched a magnificent, highly advanced satellite known as the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, or the LRO. This uncrewed probe was not designed to land on the surface, but to peacefully sweep across the sky in a highly elliptical, incredibly low polar orbit. The LRO was specifically designed to map the desolate, battered terrain of the Moon in absolutely unprecedented, staggering detail. At the lowest, most daring points of its sweeping orbit, this robotic sentinel flies a mere 31 miles above the jagged mountains and deep craters. Strapped securely to its metal frame are incredibly powerful, highly advanced optical cameras that are not constrained by the blurring atmospheric interference of our home planet. Over the past decade, as this silent satellite has continually circled the Moon, it has systematically, patiently photographed millions of square miles of the alien surface. And eventually, its unblinking mechanical eyes passed directly over the exact historic coordinates of the Sea of Tranquility. When the brilliant, high-resolution photographs taken by the LRO were finally transmitted back to Earth, they provided the world with the absolute, indisputable, jaw-dropping proof that the skeptics had demanded for decades. Sitting there in the grey dust, exactly where the telemetry data and the bouncing lasers had always pointed, is the golden, geometric shape of the Eagle's descent stage. The sun shines brightly against its metallic hull, casting a long, sharp, incredibly distinct black shadow across the undulating regolith. You can clearly see the dark shape of the silent rocket engine bell and the fragile, spidery landing struts reaching out into the dirt. But the LRO captured something even more profoundly emotional and undeniably human than the metal ship itself. When you zoom closely into these magnificent modern images, you can clearly see a chaotic, meandering web of dark, thin lines stretching away from the lander. These delicate dark lines snake their way toward the nearby scientific instruments left behind and stretch toward the massive rim of Little West Crater. These lines are not geological faults or natural cracks in the stone. They are the absolute, heavily compressed tracks of the astronauts themselves. By heavily walking through the bright, reflective top layer of the loose dust, Neil and Buzz exposed the slightly darker, heavily compacted dirt lying just beneath the surface. The LRO successfully photographed the ghostly, permanent trails of their historic spacewalk, still sitting exactly as they were created over half a century ago. The LRO did not stop at Apollo 11. As it continued its silent, continuous journey around the lunar sphere, it eventually photographed every single one of the Apollo landing sites. It beautifully captured the discarded rovers of Apollo 15, 16, and 17, sitting quietly at the ends of their twisting, perfectly preserved tire tracks. It photographed the bright, reflective backpacks thrown from the lunar modules before liftoff, and the tiny, delicate scientific experiments sitting alone in the immense darkness. It is a magnificent, sprawling, silent museum of human exploration, completely frozen in a pure vacuum, and entirely verified by the unblinking, robotic eyes of the modern era. For the most deeply entrenched conspiracy theorists, even this staggering photographic evidence is stubbornly waved away. They passionately argue that the LRO is just another NASA machine, heavily programmed to simply paint fake pixels over a blank map using advanced computer graphics. But the data from the LRO is open, entirely public, and highly utilized by independent scientific teams, universities, and international space agencies all across the globe. The Indian space probe Chandrayaan-2 and the Japanese probe Selene have also independently mapped these exact same regions and beautifully corroborated the immense silent presence of the Apollo hardware. The entire global scientific community stands completely united behind the absolute reality of these images. Let the quiet, profound comfort of this unyielding visual proof wash gently over your mind. Let the incredible achievements of modern robotic astronomy silence the lingering whispers of deception, replacing them with a deep sense of awe for what human beings can accomplish when they look up at the sky. Breathe deeply, and let the undeniable truth of those dark, winding footprints in the dust prepare you for the final step of our journey together. For soon, we must gently close the book on the physics and the photographs, to quietly reflect upon the deeply psychological reasons why we doubt, and the beautiful, monumental reality of the human spirit. As we reach the final, quiet shores of our long journey together, we must gently pull our gaze away from the brilliant, high-resolution photographs of the lunar orbiter and turn our attention slowly inward toward the complex, often chaotic landscape of the human mind. We have spent the last 14 chapters systematically unraveling the physical anomalies, the photographic illusions, and the earthly misunderstandings that have fueled the great lunar conspiracy for over half a century. We have held the cold, hard truths of vacuum physics and optical science up against the warm, comforting narratives of a Hollywood soundstage, and watched as the cinematic illusions gently dissolved into the absolute reality of deep space. But as we prepare to close this beautiful, historical book, a profound, lingering question remains suspended in the quiet air. Why do these doubts persist so stubbornly, echoing across generations, in the face of such overwhelming, undeniable scientific proof? To deeply understand the enduring psychological power of the conspiracy theory, we must summarize the incredible journey we have just taken and recognize just how easily our earthly intuition can completely deceive us. We looked closely at the iconic, brightly colored American flag and discovered that it was absolutely not fluttering in a careless studio breeze, but violently vibrating as a frictionless pendulum in a completely airless void. We stared deeply into the pitch-black lunar sky and learned that the missing stars were not a panicked omission by a nervous set designer, but the mathematically unavoidable consequence of extreme photographic exposure in the harsh, unfiltered light of the early lunar morning. We safely navigated the terrifying, invisible oceans of the Van Allen radiation belts, proving that human ingenuity, immense velocity, and brilliant navigational geometry could safely carry fragile men through a deadly storm of cosmic fire. We brought our gaze back down to the chaotic, undulating grey dust of the Sea of Tranquility and unraveled the deep mystery of the dancing shadows. We discovered that multiple studio lights were not casting intersecting artificial lines across a flat floor, but rather a single brilliant sun was interacting with an incredibly uneven three-dimensional landscape, heavily aided by the bouncing, reflective glow of Earthshine. We examined the pristine, entirely undisturbed ground resting quietly beneath the lunar module's descent engine, and learned the beautiful, counterintuitive physics of how rapidly expanding exhaust gases dissipate instantly within a pure vacuum. The engine gently touched the ancient bedrock without ever carving the fiery, explosive blast crater that our earthly minds so desperately expected to see. We magnified the legendary, sharply defined bootprint of Buzz Aldrin and realized that the total, absolute absence of liquid water was exactly what allowed the jagged, violently unweathered shards of lunar regolith to physically interlock like microscopic hooks. We looked directly through the mechanical lens of the Hasselblad cameras and watched the delicate black crosshairs naturally bleed and entirely vanish as intense, blazing white light violently scattered within the microscopic chemical layers of analog film. And perhaps most definitively, we witnessed the flawless, sweeping parabolic arcs of the lunar dust being kicked by heavy boots and rolling tires. We proved with absolute mathematical certainty that the video footage was captured in a world entirely devoid of atmospheric drag, a magnificent physical feat that is completely impossible to fake with slow-motion cameras or earthly cinematic trickery. Yet, despite all of this interlocking, unforgiving physical evidence, the great myth effortlessly survives in the modern era. The psychology behind this enduring doubt is deeply fascinating, and it is rooted entirely in our profound, instinctual human fear of the vast unknown. Space is an environment of unimaginable, terrifying hostility. It is an infinite, uncaring void of deadly radiation, extreme, freezing darkness, and absolute suffocating silence. The idea that frail, organic human beings could build a fragile, primitive machine out of aluminum and hand-woven wires, strap it to the very top of a towering controlled explosion, and safely navigate that deadly ocean to step onto another celestial body, feels almost like an impossible magical dream. For many, it is simply easier and psychologically far safer to believe in a tightly controlled earthly lie than to accept the terrifying, chaotic, and incredibly dangerous truth of human space exploration. A conspiracy theory, at its very core, offers a strange, deeply comforting illusion of absolute control. It passionately proposes a world where powerful, omniscient governments or shadowy film directors are entirely in charge of the grand historical narrative, perfectly pulling the strings behind a massive, flawless theatrical production. To heavily believe in the hoax is to believe that the universe is small, highly manageable, and strictly confined to a brightly lit soundstage hidden away in the Nevada desert. But the harsh, magnificent reality of the Apollo program is that it was absolutely not flawlessly controlled by a shadowy, omnipotent cabal. It was a massive, incredibly chaotic, deeply dangerous endeavor built upon the sweat, the tragic failures, and the relentless, exhausting dedication of over 400,000 ordinary, flawed human beings. From the brilliant structural engineers frantically drawing blueprints in Houston, to the thousands of unsung seamstresses meticulously hand-stitching the complex layers of the pressurized spacesuits, the Apollo program was a monumental, unprecedented tapestry of collective human effort. To fiercely believe that the landing was a fabricated lie requires you to also believe that every single one of those 400,000 individuals has maintained a perfect, flawless, unbroken vow of absolute silence for over 50 years. It requires you to believe that the bitterest, most scientifically advanced enemies of the United States, watching the raw telemetry with their own massive radar dishes, happily conspired to protect America's greatest, most humiliating triumph. It is a cynical, profoundly exhausting belief system that strips humanity of its greatest achievement, demanding far more blind faith in impossible human secrecy than in the proven, verifiable laws of mathematics. But what if, after hearing all the science, deeply examining all the photographs, and fully understanding the beautiful, unbending physics of the vacuum, you still find yourself holding tightly onto the doubt? What if you still look up at the silent moon hanging in the night sky and genuinely believe, deep within your heart, that the entire journey was just a beautiful, meticulously crafted cinematic fake? If that is precisely where you find yourself at the end of this journey tonight, I gently ask you to reflect upon a single, profoundly important question. What does that specific belief truly give you? And what magnificent, inspiring reality does it take away from your understanding of human potential? If we are entirely incapable of reaching the stars, if we are forever bound to the muddy dirt of this single planet by a cold cage of government deception and institutional fear, then the horizon of human achievement becomes deeply, tragically small. By finally letting go of the conspiracy, you do not simply surrender to a historical fact. You actively and joyfully invite a boundless, breathtaking sense of wonder back into your universe. The reality of Apollo 11 is not a cold, sterile scientific data point buried in an archive. It is the ultimate, soaring poetry of the human spirit. It is the undeniable, glorious proof that when we cast aside our earthly divisions and focus our collective intellect upon the seemingly impossible, we can literally reach out and touch the heavens. The dusty, jagged footprints left perfectly preserved in the sea of tranquility belong to absolutely all of us. They are a permanent, silent monument to our boundless courage, our endless curiosity, and our desperate, beautiful need to explore the dark, terrifying unknown. As our long, relaxing journey through the lunar shadows finally comes to a peaceful close, let the immense, quiet reality of that magnificent human achievement wash completely over your mind. Let the heavy, chaotic noise of the conspiracies, the angry doubts, and the endless earthly arguments gently fade away into the infinite, calming blackness of deep space. Close your eyes, feel the gentle, comforting pull of your own earthly gravity holding you safely in your bed, and allow your mind to freely drift upward toward that silent, silver sentinel in the sky. Thank you so much for walking across the regolith with us tonight. Rest well, sleep deeply, and never, ever stop looking up at the stars.